Case 1. Lacey Spears. Date of crime: January 23, 2014. Court County, Westchester County. Convicted, second-degree murder. The story began not with an obvious crime, but with a mother's desperate plea for help. At Maria Ferrari Children's Hospital in Valhalla, New York, medical staff rushed to save the life of 5-year-old Garnett Paul Spears. The boy had been admitted with mysterious symptoms, seizures, dangerously high sodium levels, and brain swelling that threatened his young life. His mother, Lacey Spears, stood by his bedside, the picture of maternal devotion, her face etched with worry as doctors worked frantically to save her only child. But something didn't add up. The medical team had seen sick children before, but Garnett's case was unusual. His sodium levels were extraordinarily high, far higher than should have been possible given the treatments he was receiving. The patterns of his illness didn't match any known medical condition. And most troubling of all, his condition seemed to deteriorate specifically when he was alone with his mother. Lacey Spears had moved to the area from Florida, settling into the Fellowship Community, a communal living environment in Chestnut Ridge, New York. The Fellowship Community was a tight-knit residential area where people lived in shared housing and worked together in various capacities. To those around her, Lacey appeared to be a dedicated single mother, chronicling her son's frequent illnesses on social media with heartbreaking detail. Her blog posts and Facebook updates painted a portrait of a warrior mom fighting alongside her constantly sick child. She documented every hospital visit, every procedure, every medication, every setback. Garnett, according to his mother's online presence, suffered from ear infections, digestive issues, feeding problems, and mysterious ailments that required frequent hospital visits. Lacey's social media following grew as people sympathized with her struggles and admired her dedication. The online community that formed around Lacey and Garnett's story was extensive. Hundreds of people followed their journey, offering prayers, support, and encouragement. Lacey seemed to thrive on the attention, posting multiple times daily about Garnett's health struggles. She shared photographs of him in hospital beds, connected to medical equipment, looking pale and weak. The narrative she constructed was compelling, a single mother devoted to her medically fragile son. But the medical community began to notice patterns that didn't fit the narrative. Garnett's illnesses seemed to spike when he was alone with his mother. His sodium levels would mysteriously skyrocket despite medical interventions designed to prevent exactly that. Nurses started asking questions. Doctors started documenting inconsistencies between what Lacey reported and what they observed. A social worker noted concerns about the mother-son relationship. Garnett's medical history was complex and troubling. He had been fitted with a gastric feeding tube, which Lacey said was necessary because of his digestive problems. Medical records showed numerous hospitalizations starting from infancy. But as doctors reviewed his history, they noticed something disturbing. Many of his symptoms only appeared when documented by his mother, not when observed by medical professionals. On January 19, 2014, Garnett was admitted to Nyack Hospital with seizures. Lacey insisted something was terribly wrong with her son, that he needed specialized care immediately. He was transferred to Maria Ferrari Children's Hospital in Valhalla, one of the region's premier pediatric facilities. There, medical staff monitored him closely in the pediatric intensive care unit. His condition was critical, but stabilizing as doctors worked to manage his sodium levels and treat his seizures, until Lacey was left alone with him. Security cameras would later reveal the horrifying truth. Footage showed Lacey Spears entering her son's hospital room, carrying a connector tube and a feeding bag. What those cameras captured would become the centerpiece of a murder prosecution. Lacey deliberately feeding high concentrations of sodium through Garnett's gastric tube, poisoning her own child even as doctors fought to save his life. The video evidence was damning. Lacey could be seen bringing items into the room, disappearing into the bathroom where the cameras could not see her, and then connecting something to Garnett's feeding tube. Afterward, his condition would deteriorate dramatically. Medical staff would rush in to respond to the crisis, while Lacey played the role of the terrified, helpless mother. On January 23, 2014, 5-year-old Garnett Paul Spears died. The cause: hypernatremia, an extremely elevated sodium level that caused his brain to swell catastrophically. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a medical mystery. It was murder, committed slowly over the course of several days, and captured on hospital security cameras. Investigators began piecing together Garnett's short life, and what they discovered was a pattern of abuse masquerading as medical care. Lacey had been poisoning Garnett throughout his life, inducing illnesses to gain attention and sympathy. She suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychiatric disorder where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in someone under their care to gain attention, sympathy, or to fulfill a psychological need. The investigation expanded to include law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions, medical experts, forensic specialists, and child abuse investigators. They examined Garnett's extensive medical records, interviewed dozens of medical professionals who had treated him, analyzed Lacey's social media presence, and reviewed financial records and communications. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who had constructed her entire identity around being the mother of a sick child. Lacey's blog posts and social media presence revealed a woman addicted to the role of devoted mother to a medically fragile son. She documented every hospital visit, every procedure, every crisis with photographs and detailed narratives. The attention she received fed something dark within her, a need for sympathy, admiration, and the role of heroic mother that required Garnett to be perpetually ill. Medical experts who reviewed Garnett's records noted that many of his reported symptoms couldn't be verified by medical testing. His digestive issues, which Lacey claimed necessitated the feeding tube, were not consistently documented by physicians. His developmental delays and other problems seemed to exist primarily in his mother's accounts rather than in objective medical assessments. When Garnett started to get healthier, when doctors suggested he might be able to have his feeding tube removed and eat normally, Lacey couldn't allow it. She needed him sick. She needed him suffering. She needed the attention that came from being the mother of a special needs child. And when simply exaggerating symptoms was no longer enough, she actively poisoned him. The method she used was particularly cruel. Sodium, when administered in high concentrations, causes extreme thirst, confusion, seizures, and ultimately brain damage. Garnett would have experienced terrible symptoms as his mother poisoned him. He would have suffered immensely in his final days. And all the while, Lacey documented his decline on social media, garnering sympathy and attention even as she caused his death. The trial was a media sensation that gripped the New York metropolitan area and beyond. Prosecutors presented devastating evidence. The surveillance footage showing Lacey entering Garnett's room with feeding equipment, medical records showing impossible sodium spikes that could only have been caused by deliberate administration, testimony from doctors who had grown suspicious of Lacey's behavior, and digital evidence of her researching sodium poisoning online. Computer forensics revealed that Lacey had searched for information about sodium and its effects on the human body. She had researched how much sodium it would take to cause serious harm. She had looked up symptoms of sodium poisoning. The searches demonstrated premeditation and knowledge of what she was doing to her son. The prosecution also presented evidence of Lacey's psychological state and her pattern of behavior. Mental health experts testified about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, explaining how someone with this disorder derives psychological satisfaction from the attention received as the caregiver of a sick person. They explained that people with this disorder often have extensive medical knowledge, are skilled at manipulating medical professionals, and can be extremely convincing in their role as devoted caregiver. Lacey's social media presence was entered into evidence. Prosecutors showed the jury post after post documenting Garnett's illnesses, highlighting how Lacey seemed to thrive on the sympathy and attention she received. They demonstrated that her entire social identity was built around being Garnett's mother and caregiver. Without a sick child, she would lose that identity and the community that had formed around it. Witnesses from the fellowship community testified about Lacey's behavior. Some described her as a devoted mother who seemed overwhelmed by Garnett's medical needs. Others noted inconsistencies, how Garnett seemed healthier and more energetic when he was with other caregivers, how Lacey seemed to exaggerate his symptoms, how she resisted suggestions that might make Garnett more independent. Medical professionals who had treated Garnett testified about their growing concerns. Several nurses described how they had documented their suspicions that something wasn't right about the mother-son relationship. Doctors explained how Garnett's symptoms didn't match any known medical condition and how they had begun to suspect the mother might be causing the problems. Lacey's defense team faced an uphill battle. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The surveillance footage was particularly damning. It clearly showed her entering the room with feeding equipment and Garnett's condition deteriorating afterward. The defense argued she was a loving mother, that Garnett's death was a tragic medical mystery, that perhaps the hospital had made errors in his treatment. But the jury saw through the performance. The defense attempted to present Lacey as a victim herself, a single mother overwhelmed by the challenges of caring for a medically complex child, someone who had made mistakes but never intended harm. They suggested that perhaps Garnett had a rare, undiagnosed condition that caused his sodium levels to spike unpredictably. But medical experts thoroughly refuted these theories, explaining that the patterns seen in Garnett's case could only result from deliberate administration of sodium. The trial lasted several weeks and included emotional testimony from family members, friends, medical professionals, and investigators. The courtroom was packed with observers, media representatives, and people who had followed the case since Garnett's death. The proceedings were extensively covered by local and national media, with many outlets noting the disturbing nature of the crime and the betrayal of the mother-child bond it represented. In April 2015, after deliberating for several days, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Lacey Spears showed little emotion as the verdict was read. She was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, the maximum sentence for second-degree murder in New York State. During the sentencing hearing, the judge spoke directly to Lacey, telling her that she had violated the most sacred trust, that between mother and child. The judge noted that Garnett had trusted her completely, had relied on her for his very survival, and she had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. The judge also noted the premeditation involved, the calculated nature of the poisoning, and the fact that Lacey had persisted in harming Garnett even as medical professionals tried desperately to save his life. Garnett never had a chance at a normal childhood. His entire life was manipulated by the woman who should have protected him most. From infancy onward, his illnesses weren't random, they were inflicted. His suffering wasn't unfortunate, it was calculated. His frequent hospitalizations weren't the result of bad luck or genetic problems, they were the direct result of his mother's actions. And his death wasn't tragic, it was murder. Friends and family members who spoke after the trial expressed shock and betrayal. Many had supported Lacey throughout Garnett's life, believing her accounts of his medical struggles, offering help and sympathy. They felt manipulated and deceived. Some expressed guilt that they hadn't seen through Lacey's deception and wondered if they could have done something to save Garnett. The fellowship community, where Lacey and Garnett had lived, was devastated. The close-knit residential community had embraced Lacey and her son, offering support and friendship. Learning that Garnett's illnesses had been fabricated and that he had been murdered by his mother shattered the community's trust and innocence. The case prompted discussions about Munchausen syndrome by proxy and how medical professionals can better identify and respond to suspected cases. Hospitals reviewed their protocols for monitoring parents and caregivers with hospitalized children. Medical journals published articles about the Spears case, using it as an example of the importance of maintaining suspicion when patterns don't make medical sense. Social media companies also face questions about their role in enabling Lacey's behavior. Her extensive online documentation of Garnett's illnesses had provided her with the attention and validation she craved. Some observers suggested that social media platforms should develop better mechanisms for identifying and responding to content that might indicate child abuse disguised as medical care. Garnett Paul Spears would have turned 12 years old in 2021. He should have been starting middle school, discovering his interests, making friends, and growing into adolescence. Instead, his life ended at 5 years old, cut short by the woman who brought him into the world. He is remembered not for what he accomplished, but for what was stolen from him. The chance to live, to grow, to experience life beyond hospital rooms and feeding tubes. Lacey Spears remains incarcerated in New York State prison system. She will not be eligible for parole until 2035, when she will be 48 years old. Whether she will ever be released depends on parole board determinations of her rehabilitation and risk to public safety. For now, she serves her sentence while Garnett remains forever 5 years old, a victim of maternal betrayal that shocked a nation. And if you haven't already, please like this video, and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files to help us continue bringing awareness to these important cases. Case 2. Geraldine Perkins. Date of crime: September 26, 2016. Court County, New York County, Manhattan. Pled guilty, manslaughter. The neighbors in the Harlem apartment building had heard the screams before. They'd seen the bruises on the little boy's face when he occasionally appeared outside. They'd reported their concerns to the Administration for Children's Services multiple times, filling out forms, making phone calls, doing everything they believed they should do to protect a child they feared was being abused. But somehow, 6-year-old Izquierdo Perkins kept falling through the cracks of a system designed to protect him, until it was too late. On September 26, 2016, emergency responders rushed to an apartment on West 135th Street in Harlem. The 911 call had come from Geraldine Perkins, Izquierdo's mother, reporting that her son was unconscious and not breathing. When paramedics arrived, they found a scene that immediately triggered their suspicions. Izquierdo's small body was covered in wounds that told a story of prolonged, systematic abuse. He had bruises in various stages of healing, fresh purple marks alongside yellow-green bruises that were weeks old. He had burns on his body. He had lacerations. He showed signs of severe malnutrition, his small frame emaciated and weighing far less than a healthy 6-year-old should. Paramedics worked frantically, performing CPR and rushing the child to Harlem Hospital. But the damage was too extensive. Izquierdo's injuries were catastrophic. His young body had endured trauma that would have challenged an adult to survive. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital, his short life ending in a hospital emergency room surrounded by strangers desperately trying to save him. The investigation that followed revealed a nightmare that had been unfolding in plain sight for months. Geraldine Perkins, Izquierdo's mother, had subjected her son to months of horrific abuse alongside her boyfriend, Rishiam Smith. The apartment where Izquierdo died became a crime scene that shocked even veteran investigators who had seen decades of domestic violence and child abuse cases. Evidence of torture was everywhere. Investigators found belts that had been used for beatings, the leather worn and marked from repeated use against a child's body. They found signs that Izquierdo had been denied food as punishment, with the other children in the home fed while he went hungry. They found burn marks on furniture and walls consistent with cigarettes or other implements being used to deliberately burn the child. The apartment, on the surface an ordinary Harlem residence, had been transformed into a place of systematic torture for one small boy. Forensic analysis revealed that Izquierdo had sustained injuries over an extended period. The various stages of healing seen in his bruises indicated ongoing abuse, not a single incident gone wrong. Medical examiners documented fractures that had healed improperly, suggesting previous injuries that had never received medical attention. Izquierdo's malnutrition wasn't the result of poverty or food insecurity. There was adequate food in the home. He had been specifically and deliberately denied nutrition as a form of punishment and control. But perhaps most damning in the investigation was the timeline of missed interventions. The Administration for Children's Services had received multiple reports about Izquierdo's welfare over the months leading up to his death. Neighbors had called to report hearing screams and crying from the apartment. They had seen Izquierdo with visible bruises and reported their concerns. Concerned citizens who encountered the child in the building or neighborhood had raised alarms. Teachers at his school had noticed signs of abuse and filed the legally mandated reports. Yet the system failed to remove Izquierdo from danger. ACS case workers had visited the apartment on multiple occasions. They had documented concerns in their reports. They had opened and closed cases. But each time, they failed to act decisively enough to save Izquierdo's life. Later investigations would reveal that caseworkers had not followed proper protocols, had accepted implausible explanations for Izquierdo's injuries, and had failed to exercise their authority to remove a child from an obviously dangerous situation. The abuse had been escalating for months before Izquierdo's death. According to the later investigation and testimony from witnesses, Geraldine and her boyfriend Rishiam Smith used violence as their primary parenting tool. They beat Izquierdo for minor infractions, taking food without permission, not completing chores to their satisfaction, behavior that any 6-year-old might engage in. They withheld food systematically, using hunger as both punishment and control. They isolated him from the other children in the household, singling him out for abuse while treating the other children with relative normalcy. Neighbors who testified later described hearing screams and thumping sounds from the apartment. Some heard Izquierdo crying and begging. Others heard adult voices yelling threats and obscenities at the child. Several neighbors had called 911 or contacted ACS specifically because they feared for Izquierdo's life. But each time, the response was inadequate to the danger the child faced. On that September day in 2016, the abuse reached its fatal conclusion. The exact sequence of events that led to Izquierdo's death involved blunt force trauma, so severe that the child's body simply gave out. Medical examiners determined he died from a combination of acute injuries and the cumulative effects of chronic abuse, malnutrition, and neglect. His death was not instantaneous. He suffered before he died. Geraldine Perkins could have stopped it at any point. She could have protected her son from her boyfriend's violence. She could have left the relationship and taken her children to safety. She could have accepted help from social services when it was offered. She could have sought assistance from family members, friends, or community organizations. Instead, she participated in the abuse. She allowed the violence. She watched her son deteriorate and did nothing to save him. More than that, she actively participated in the torture, denying him food, administering beatings, and creating the environment where his death became inevitable. The case sparked immediate and sustained outrage across New York City and beyond. Media coverage was extensive and critical, focusing both on the horrific abuse Izquierdo endured and on the systemic failures that allowed it to continue. Editorials demanded accountability. Community members held vigils and protests. Child welfare advocates called for comprehensive reform of the child protective system. Mayor Bill de Blasio responded to the public outrage by ordering a complete overhaul of administration for children's services procedures. An external investigation was commissioned to review the handling of Izquierdo's case and identify the failures that led to his death. The investigation revealed numerous breakdowns in protocol, poor judgment by caseworkers, inadequate supervision, and systemic problems with how ACS assessed risk and made decisions about child safety. Multiple ACS caseworkers were fired in the wake of the investigation. Supervisors were demoted or removed from their positions. Protocols were changed to require more frequent visits, better documentation, and lower thresholds for removing children from dangerous situations. Training programs were overhauled to help caseworkers better identify signs of abuse and understand the dynamics of domestic violence. But none of it could bring Izquierdo back. No reform, no firing. No protocol change could restore the life of a 6-year-old boy who had endured months of torture before dying in pain and fear. Geraldine Perkins and Rishiam Smith were both arrested and charged in Izquierdo's death. The prosecution built a strong case based on medical evidence, testimony from neighbors and school personnel, ACS records documenting the reports of abuse, and forensic evidence from the apartment. Both defendants initially pleaded not guilty, but faced with overwhelming evidence, Geraldine eventually changed her plea. In 2018, Geraldine Perkins pled guilty to manslaughter in exchange for a reduced sentence. The plea agreement spared her a trial where she would have faced more serious murder charges and potentially a longer sentence. Instead, she was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The judge, in accepting the plea and imposing the sentence, spoke about the betrayal inherent in a mother's failure to protect her child. The judge noted that while Geraldine herself may have been in an abusive relationship, that did not excuse her failure to protect Izquierdo or her active participation in his abuse. Her boyfriend, Rishiam Smith, proceeded to trial and was convicted of murder. He received a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. The jury in his trial heard extensive testimony about the abuse he inflicted on Izquierdo and rejected his defense that the child's death was accidental. But even with both defendants convicted and imprisoned, the legal outcomes felt hollow to those who knew that Izquierdo's death was preventable. Community members who had tried to help expressed frustration and anger that their reports had not been taken seriously enough. Teachers who had documented their concerns felt guilt that they hadn't done more, even though they had followed all required reporting procedures. Neighbors who had called authorities wondered what else they could have done to save the little boy they occasionally saw in their building. 6-year-old Izquierdo Perkins loved superheroes, particularly Spider-Man. He enjoyed drawing and showed artistic talent despite his young age. He was a child who, in different circumstances, might have grown up to be an artist, a teacher, a father himself. He was a child who deserved love, protection, and a chance at life. Instead, he endured torture at the hands of the woman who gave birth to him and the man she chose over her son's safety. His last months were filled with pain, fear, and betrayal. He went to bed hungry while others ate. He nursed injuries that never received medical care. He lived in constant fear of the next beating, the next punishment, the next deprivation. And when he needed rescue most, the systems meant to protect him moved too slowly and too cautiously to save his life. The reforms implemented after Nixzmary's death have potentially saved other children. ACS reports that the changes in protocols have led to more children being removed from dangerous situations. Training improvements have helped caseworkers better identify risk factors. Lower thresholds for intervention have meant that questionable situations are more likely to result in protective action. But child welfare advocates argue that systemic problems remain. ACS caseworkers still carry overwhelming caseloads that make thorough investigation difficult. Budget constraints limit the resources available for family services and support. Legal standards for removing children from homes remain high, requiring clear evidence of danger. And coordination between different agencies, schools, police, hospitals, ACS, remains imperfect. Nixzmary's case stands as a stark reminder that protecting children requires more than just having systems in place. It requires those systems to function effectively, to respond quickly, and to prioritize child safety above all other considerations. It requires caseworkers who are properly trained, adequately supported, and empowered to make difficult decisions. It requires neighbors who report concerns and keep reporting them even when initial reports seem to go nowhere. And it requires a society that refuses to accept that some children's suffering is inevitable or acceptable. Geraldine Perkins remains incarcerated. She will not be eligible for parole until 2033. Whether she will ever be released depends on parole board assessments of her rehabilitation, remorse, and risk to society. For now, she serves her sentence while Nixzmary remains forever 6 years old, a child whose suffering and death exposed deep flaws in the systems meant to protect New York's most vulnerable children. If you want to stay updated on this case as it proceeds through the legal system, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Silent Files with notifications turned on. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and please, hit that like button to help this video reach more people who need to hear these important stories. Case 3. Nixzaliz Santiago. Date of crime, January 10, 2006. Court County, Kings County, Brooklyn. Convicted, manslaughter. The name Nixzmary Brown became synonymous with systemic failure in child protection. Her death exposed the cracks in New York's safety net and forced a reckoning with how authorities respond to child abuse allegations. But before she became a symbol, before her name became attached to reform legislation, before her case prompted citywide changes, she was a 7-year-old girl trapped in a house of horrors in Brooklyn, enduring unimaginable suffering while the world outside remained largely oblivious to her plight. Nixzmary lived in a small apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, with her mother Nixzaliz Santiago, her stepfather Cesar Rodriguez, and several siblings. To the outside world, they were just another struggling family in the neighborhood, one of thousands trying to make ends meet in an expensive city. The building where they lived was typical of the area, a multi-family dwelling with thin walls, shared spaces, and the complex dynamics of urban living where privacy and community exist in constant tension. But inside that apartment, behind closed doors, Nixzmary was being systematically tortured. The abuse had been ongoing for years, escalating in severity and frequency. Nixzmary was singled out among the children for particularly cruel treatment. While her siblings were fed, clothed reasonably well, and allowed to play, Nixzmary faced a different reality entirely. She was locked in a small, unheated room for hours or days at a time. The room where she was confined was barely larger than a closet, with no toys, no comfort, nothing to occupy a child's mind during the long hours of isolation. In winter, the room was freezing, and Nixzmary was denied adequate clothing or blankets. In summer, it was stifling hot, with no ventilation or relief from the heat. She was denied food while her siblings ate regular meals. This wasn't occasional punishment. It was systematic starvation designed to break her spirit and assert complete control over her. Nixzmary would watch through doorways as her siblings ate, her stomach empty, knowing that she alone was being denied this basic necessity. Sometimes she was allowed to eat only after everyone else had finished, and then only minimal amounts. Other times, she was given no food at all for extended periods. She was beaten regularly with various implements, belts, cables, hands, whatever was convenient for her abusers. The beatings were severe enough to leave extensive bruising and, in some cases, deeper injuries. They were administered for infractions both real and imagined, taking food without permission, failing to complete chores perfectly, even for normal childhood behavior like crying or expressing needs. Neighbors occasionally heard screams coming from the apartment, piercing cries that cut through the normal urban noise. But in an environment where noise is constant, music playing, people arguing, children playing loudly, televisions blaring, the cries of one small girl sometimes got lost in the cacophony. Some neighbors did report concerns, calling authorities or mentioning their worries to building management, but these reports often went nowhere or resulted in cursory investigations that failed to uncover the abuse. On January 10, 2006, Nixzaliz Santiago called 911. Her voice on the recording was frantic as she reported that her daughter was unconscious and not breathing. When paramedics arrived at the apartment, they found a scene that immediately raised red flags. Nixzmary's lifeless body lay on the floor, and the condition of that small body told a story of prolonged suffering. The child was emaciated, her body showing signs of severe malnutrition that had developed over months. She weighed only 36 pounds, far below the healthy weight for a 7-year-old, which should be around 50 to 60 pounds. Her body was covered in bruises in various stages of healing, indicating ongoing abuse rather than a single incident. She had cuts and scars that had never received medical treatment. She had a severe head injury that appeared to be the immediate cause of her unconsciousness. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy would later determine that Nixzmary died from a blow to the head combined with malnutrition and the cumulative effects of chronic abuse. Her death wasn't the result of one beating. It was the inevitable conclusion of systematic torture that had destroyed her body's ability to survive. Her small frame had endured more suffering than most people experience in a lifetime, and it had finally given out. The apartment where she died became a crime scene as investigators processed every room, documenting evidence of the abuse. They found the small room where Nixzmary had been confined, its walls marked and dirty, with no signs of the comfort a child's space should contain. They found evidence that she had been denied access to the bathroom, forced to soil herself and endure the humiliation and discomfort that resulted. They found signs that while the other children had toys, clothes, and normal childhood possessions, Nixzmary had been denied these basics. Investigators interviewed the other children in the home, a difficult process given their young ages and the trauma they had witnessed. The siblings described seeing Nixzmary locked away, hearing her cry, watching her go hungry. Some had tried to sneak food to her. Others had been threatened not to help her. All had been forced to witness their sister's suffering while being powerless to stop it. The investigation revealed that Nixzmary had been singled out for abuse while her siblings were treated relatively normally. This differential treatment is characteristic of certain child abuse patterns, where one child in a family becomes the scapegoat for the parent's rage, frustration, or psychological dysfunction. The reasons for this targeting can be complex. Sometimes the child resembles a person the parent resents. Sometimes the child is from a previous relationship. Sometimes there is no clear reason beyond the parent's psychological pathology. In Nixzmary's case, the reason for her targeting remained unclear, but the pattern was unmistakable. While her siblings attended school regularly, wore appropriate clothing, and were fed adequately, Nixzmary suffered deprivation in every area. The abuse wasn't random or equally distributed. It was specifically and deliberately directed at one child. Nixzaliz Santiago had watched the abuse. She had participated in it. She had isolated Nixzmary from the other children, treating her own daughter as less deserving of food, warmth, and basic human dignity. While Nixzaliz's boyfriend Cesar Rodriguez delivered many of the beatings and was the primary source of violence, Nixzaliz enabled every single act of abuse. She never intervened to protect her daughter. She never sought help for the family's dysfunction. She never removed Nixzmary from the situation or removed herself and her children from the abusive boyfriend. More than passive enabling, Nixzaliz actively participated in the abuse. She enforced Nixzmary's isolation, denied her food, and punished her harshly. She had opportunities every day to change course, to protect her daughter, to seek help. Instead, she chose to continue the abuse, to prioritize her relationship with Rodriguez over her daughter's safety, and to watch as Nixzmary deteriorated before her eyes. The investigation revealed that teachers at Public School 41 in Greenwich Village, where Nixzmary was enrolled, had noticed concerning signs. The child came to school with bruises that she couldn't or wouldn't explain. She wore inadequate clothing even in winter, sometimes arriving without a coat despite frigid temperatures. She appeared withdrawn and fearful, exhibiting behavior consistent with trauma. Teachers reported seeing her steal food or eat with desperate hunger during lunch, suggesting she wasn't being fed adequately at home. School personnel had filed reports with the Administration for Children's Services, as they were legally mandated to do when they suspected abuse or neglect. They documented the bruises, the inadequate clothing, the behavioral concerns. They followed the protocols designed to protect children. But somehow, the system failed to respond effectively. The Administration for Children's Services had received multiple reports about conditions in the Nixzmary's home over the months and years preceding her death. Caseworkers had visited the apartment on at least one occasion. They had interviewed Nixzaliz and reviewed the allegations. But each time, the case was closed without Nixzmary being removed from the home or the family receiving intensive services. Later investigations into ACS handling of the case revealed numerous failures. Caseworkers hadn't adequately investigated the reports. They had accepted implausible explanations for Nixzmary's bruises. They hadn't interviewed Nixzmary alone or in an environment where she might feel safe revealing the truth. They hadn't looked carefully enough at the conditions in the home or noticed that one child was being treated dramatically differently than the others. These failures weren't unique to Nixzmary's case. They reflected systemic problems in how child protective services operated in New York City at that time. Caseworkers carried overwhelming caseloads that made thorough investigation difficult. Training was inadequate for identifying subtle signs of abuse or understanding family dynamics. The legal standard for removing children from homes was high, requiring clear evidence of imminent danger. And coordination between different agencies, schools, hospitals, police, ACS, was often poor, with information not being shared effectively. The trial of Nixzaliz Santiago and Cesar Rodriguez was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Evidence presented in court included photographs of Nixzmary's injuries that shocked even hardened court personnel. Medical experts testified about the extent of her suffering, describing in clinical detail the effects of chronic malnutrition, repeated beatings, and systematic neglect. Teachers and neighbors testified about what they had witnessed and reported. The photographs of Nixzmary shown in court revealed the full horror of what she had endured. Her emaciated body, covered in bruises and scars, told a story of systematic torture. Her medical records showed injuries and malnutrition that had developed over extended periods. The evidence was overwhelming that this was not a case of discipline gone wrong or a single incident of violence. This was prolonged, deliberate abuse that culminated in death. Nixzaliz Santiago's defense attorneys argued that she was also a victim of domestic violence, afraid of her boyfriend Cesar Rodriguez and unable to protect her daughter. They presented evidence that Rodriguez was violent and controlling, that Nixzaliz feared him, that she too had been abused. They argued for understanding and leniency, suggesting that Nixzaliz was trapped in an impossible situation where protecting herself and her other children required sacrificing Nixzmary. But prosecutors argued, and the jury agreed, that being a victim of domestic violence doesn't absolve a parent of responsibility to protect their children. They pointed out that Nixzaliz had opportunities to leave, to seek help, to contact authorities. They emphasized that even if Rodriguez was the primary abuser, Nixzaliz had actively participated in the abuse, not merely failed to prevent it. She had denied Nixzmary food, locked her in the room, and watched as the child deteriorated without seeking medical care or intervention. The prosecution presented expert testimony about domestic violence and its effects on victims, acknowledging that abusive relationships can create psychological barriers to leaving and can impair judgment. But they distinguished between being unable to leave an abusive relationship and actively participating in child abuse. They argued that even in the worst domestic violence situations, parents retain a fundamental obligation to protect their children, and that obligation includes seeking help even at personal risk. In 2008, after a trial that captured citywide attention, Nixzaliz Santiago was convicted of manslaughter. The jury rejected the more serious murder charge, but found that she was criminally responsible for Nixzmary's death through her actions and failures to act. She was sentenced to 43 years to life in prison, one of the longest sentences given for manslaughter in New York State, reflecting the severity of the crime and the prolonged suffering Nixzmary endured. Her boyfriend, Cesar Rodriguez, was convicted of more serious charges including murder. He received a sentence of 29 years to life in prison. During his sentencing, the judge spoke directly about the cruelty of the abuse Rodriguez inflicted and his responsibility as the primary perpetrator of violence against Nixzmary. Nixzmary's death prompted immediate and sweeping reforms in New York's child welfare system. Mayor Michael Bloomberg, facing intense public pressure and criticism, ordered comprehensive investigations into ACS practices. The commissioner of ACS resigned. Multiple caseworkers and supervisors involved in Nixzmary's case were fired or reassigned. Protocols were changed to require more frequent visits to homes where abuse was suspected. Training was improved to help caseworkers better identify signs of abuse and understand when children are in danger. The threshold for intervention was lowered, making it easier to remove children from potentially dangerous situations. And coordination between agencies was improved, with better systems for sharing information and tracking children across different institutional contacts. But advocates argued that the reforms, while necessary, didn't address fundamental problems with the child welfare system. They pointed out that ACS remained understaffed and underfunded, with caseworkers still carrying too many cases to thoroughly investigate each one. They noted that the legal standards for intervention, while somewhat lowered, still required substantial evidence before children could be removed from homes. And they emphasized that no system of reforms could completely prevent tragedies when determined abusers are skilled at hiding their actions and intimidating victims into silence. 7-year-old Nixzmary Brown died alone, in pain, and betrayed by the woman who should have been her fiercest protector. Her short life was marked by suffering that no child should endure. She went to bed hungry. She endured beatings. She lived in isolation and fear. She reached out for help through her behavior and through things she told teachers, but the help came too late. Her life mattered beyond her role as a catalyst for reform. She was a child with personality, preferences, and potential. Teachers remembered her as sweet when she smiled, though those smiles became increasingly rare in the months before her death. Classmates remembered her as quiet and shy. She had dreams, though she rarely got to express them. She deserved to grow up, to discover who she might become, to experience joy and safety and love. Instead, she became a symbol of system failure, a name attached to reforms, a case study in what happens when protective systems don't function as they should. Her death changed how New York City approaches child protection, influenced policies across the country, and remains a touchstone in discussions of child welfare. But those larger impacts shouldn't overshadow the individual tragedy. One small girl who suffered and died while adults who should have protected her either abused her or failed to intervene effectively. Nixzaliz Santiago remains in prison, serving her sentence at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York. She will not be eligible for parole until 2051, when she will be in her 80s if she lives that long. The parole board will then assess whether she has been rehabilitated, whether she has taken responsibility for her role in Nixzmary's death, and whether she poses any risk to society if released. The reforms implemented in Nixzmary's name have potentially saved other children from similar fates. ACS reports improved outcomes, with more children being removed from dangerous situations and more families receiving services before abuse escalates to lethal levels. But every year, children still die from abuse in New York, reminding us that protecting vulnerable children remains an ongoing challenge that requires constant vigilance, adequate resources, and a willingness to intervene even when intervention is difficult or uncertain. Nixzmary Brown's short life and brutal death will not be forgotten. Her name lives on in the protocols designed to protect other children, in the training caseworkers receive, in the heightened awareness of child abuse indicators. But most importantly, she should be remembered as a child who deserved better, better from her mother, better from her stepfather, better from the systems meant to protect her, and better from a society that allowed her suffering to continue until it killed her. And please, leave a comment below, hit the like button, and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files so we can continue covering cases that need attention. Case 4, Awilda Lopez. Date of crime, November 22, 1995. Court County, New York County, Manhattan. Convicted, second-degree murder. In a Greenwich Village apartment, a neighborhood known for its bohemian culture, artistic legacy, and progressive values, 6-year-old Elisa Izquierdo lived a life of unimaginable horror that stood in stark contrast to the vibrant community outside her door. Her story would become one of the most notorious child abuse cases in New York City history, exposing failures across multiple systems and institutions meant to protect vulnerable children and prompting soul-searching questions about how such suffering could occur in plain sight in one of the world's most sophisticated cities. Elisa was born in 1989 to Cuban immigrant parents in New York City. Her father, Gustavo Izquierdo, was a devoted parent who provided a loving, stable home during Elisa's early years. Those who knew Gustavo described him as gentle, patient, and completely dedicated to his daughter. He worked hard to provide for her, despite limited resources. He ensured she attended preschool, had toys and books, and experienced the security and love every child deserves. Elisa's early years with her father were, by all accounts, happy. Photographs from this period show a smiling little girl with bright eyes and an innocent joy. She was curious about the world, eager to learn, and developing normally. Her father's family was involved in her life, providing extended family support and love. But when Gustavo died of cancer in May 1994, everything changed for 6-year-old Elisa. Despite the wishes of Gustavo's family, who desperately wanted to continue caring for the child they loved, custody of Elisa went to her biological mother, Awilda Lopez. It was a death sentence disguised as a custody arrangement, a bureaucratic decision that condemned a little girl to hell. Awilda Lopez was a crack cocaine addict with a history of violence and instability. She had not been consistently involved in Elisa's life during the years the child lived with her father. She had a documented history of drug abuse, erratic behavior, and poor judgment. She was living in a chaotic situation with multiple children from different relationships, in an apartment that was frequently the scene of drug use and domestic violence. Gustavo's family fought the custody determination. They went to court arguing that Elisa should stay with them, with people who loved her and had been caring for her. They presented evidence of Awilda's unfitness as a parent. But the legal system in New York had a strong preference for biological parents, and despite the family's concerns, custody went to Awilda. The judge's reasoning reflected assumptions about maternal bonds and mothers' rights that would be fundamentally challenged by what happened next. Within months of gaining custody, Awilda Lopez began subjecting Elisa to sadistic abuse that escalated in severity and frequency until it culminated in the child's death. The transformation in Elisa's life was immediate and total. She went from a safe, loving home to a nightmare where every day brought new suffering. The child was beaten with various objects including belts, hairbrushes, and the heels of shoes. These weren't occasional spankings or discipline gone too far. These were brutal beatings administered with objects designed to cause maximum pain. Elisa's body would be found covered in bruises, welts, and scars from these repeated beatings. She was locked in closets for extended periods, sometimes for days at a time. The spaces where she was confined were small, dark, and filthy. She was given no toys, no books, no comfort. Sometimes she was denied access to a bathroom while locked away, forced to soil herself and endure the humiliation and discomfort that resulted. She was burned with cigarettes, the small circular scars marking her body like a map of her suffering. These burns were deliberately inflicted as punishment, creating painful wounds that would scar permanently. She was sexually abused with implements, violations so horrific that even hardened investigators and medical examiners were shaken by the evidence. The sexual abuse was sadistic and depraved, inflicting both physical damage and psychological trauma beyond comprehension. She was forced to eat her own vomit and feces, degradation designed not just to hurt, but to break her spirit and destroy her sense of human dignity. This type of abuse reflects a level of cruelty that goes beyond violence into deliberate psychological torture. The apartment became a torture chamber for one little girl, while Awilda's other children were treated relatively normally. This differential treatment, similar to the pattern in Nixzmary Brown's case, meant that some children in the home lived relatively normal lives while Elisa endured systematic torture. The other children were fed adequately, beaten less frequently and severely, and allowed normal childhood activities. Elisa alone was singled out for the worst abuse. Despite the horror occurring behind closed doors, people outside the home noticed and reported concerns. Elisa attended Public School 41 in Greenwich Village, a well-regarded elementary school with caring teachers and staff. Those teachers noticed the signs almost immediately when Elisa entered their classroom. They saw the bruises that covered her small body, marks that were visible even when she wore clothing designed to hide them. They noticed her withdrawn behavior, how she flinched when adults made sudden movements, how she seemed fearful and traumatized. They observed signs of trauma in her behavior, difficulty concentrating, emotional outbursts, or conversely, an unnatural silence and compliance. They reported their concerns to Child Protective Services, filing the legally mandated reports when they suspected abuse. They documented the bruises, took notes on concerning behaviors, and tried to create a paper trail that would trigger intervention. They weren't making vague reports based on hunches. They were reporting clear, visible signs that a child was being abused. Elisa's biological father's family tried desperately to regain custody or at least get authorities to investigate and intervene. They filed reports about the abuse they suspected. They tried to maintain contact with Elisa and document the changes they saw in her. They went to court seeking custody modifications. They did everything they could within the legal system to save her. Even Elisa herself told school officials that her mother was hurting her. Despite being only 6 years old, despite the fear that must have terrified her into silence most of the time, she gathered the courage to tell adults at school what was happening at home. She showed them bruises. She told them her mother hurt her. She asked for help in the only way a 6-year-old knows how. But the reports went nowhere. Cases were opened and closed by the Administration for Children's Services without adequate investigation. When caseworkers visited the home, Awilda would clean up, present a reasonable front, and offer explanations for Elisa's injuries that the caseworkers accepted without sufficient scrutiny. Reports from the school were filed, but not followed up with the intensity and urgency they deserved. The pattern was similar to what would later be seen in the Nixzmary Brown case. Multiple reports from credible sources, visible signs of abuse, a child literally asking for help, and a system that responded inadequately. The bureaucracy moved slowly, prioritized keeping families together, gave the mother the benefit of the doubt, and failed to act decisively to save a child who was being tortured. On November 22, 1995, Awilda Lopez called 911 claiming Elisa had stopped breathing. When paramedics arrived, they found a scene of horror that would haunt them for years afterward. Elisa's tiny body was covered in injuries that told the story of systematic, prolonged torture. She had bruises covering most of her body in various stages of healing. She had burns from cigarettes. She had lacerations and scars. She showed evidence of sexual assault. She had a severe head injury that appeared to be from blunt force trauma. The medical examiner would later determine she had been beaten to death, her brain hemorrhaging from the trauma of a final, fatal blow. The autopsy revealed the full extent of Elisa's suffering in clinical detail that was almost unbearable to read. Her body bore signs of prolonged, systematic torture. She had injuries in various stages of healing, indicating the abuse had been ongoing for months. Old fractures that had healed improperly, scars from burns and cuts, evidence of sexual trauma, and the fatal head injury that had finally killed her. She was malnourished, her small body showing signs of chronic food deprivation. At 6 years old, she should have been growing and developing normally. Instead, her growth had been stunted by malnutrition and chronic stress. Her weight was far below normal for her age. Her development had been impacted by the sustained trauma she endured. The case ignited immediate and sustained public outrage unlike anything New York City had seen in years. The media coverage was extensive and graphic, with newspapers publishing details of the abuse that shocked readers. How could a child under the supervision of Child Protective Services be tortured to death? How many reports had been ignored? How many chances had there been to save Elisa? These questions dominated editorial pages, radio talk shows, and conversations across the city. The headlines screamed for accountability. System failed Elisa, tortured to death while authorities looked away. A little girl's desperate cry for help went unheard. Editorial boards demanded reform. Community leaders held press conferences. Child welfare advocates organized protests. Politicians faced intense pressure to explain how this could happen and promise it would never happen again. Investigators began piecing together the cascade of failures that led to one child's horrific death. They reviewed every report that had been filed about Elisa. They interviewed every caseworker who had been involved in her case. They examined policies, protocols, and decisions. What they found was a system that had failed at almost every level to protect a child who was being tortured in plain sight. Awilda Lopez showed no remorse when arrested and during the subsequent investigation and trial. Her behavior was striking in its lack of normal maternal emotion. She remained largely emotionless when confronted with evidence of what she had done to Elisa. She offered weak explanations for Elisa's injuries, suggesting the child was clumsy, disobedient, or accident-prone. She claimed Elisa was difficult, disobedient, and deserving of punishment. She characterized normal childhood behavior as deliberate defiance that required harsh discipline. She showed no recognition that what she had done constituted torture and murder rather than legitimate parenting. Her statements revealed a complete lack of empathy for her daughter's suffering. But the evidence was overwhelming. Medical examiners testified about the extent and nature of Elisa's injuries, explaining that they were inconsistent with accidents or normal childhood injuries and clearly indicated systematic abuse. Teachers testified about the bruises they had seen and the reports they had filed. Neighbors testified about sounds they had heard from the apartment. Investigators presented photographs, medical records, and forensic evidence. This wasn't discipline gone too far. This was torture culminating in murder. The brutality of the abuse, its sustained nature over months, and the severity of Elisa's final injuries all pointed to deliberate, sadistic violence rather than excessive punishment or parental stress. In 1996, Awilda Lopez was convicted of second-degree murder. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a guilty verdict. She was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, a sentence that many thought was too lenient given the horrific nature of her crimes. The case led to immediate consequences for child welfare officials. The commissioner of the Administration for Children's Services resigned under pressure. Multiple supervisors and caseworkers involved in Elisa's case were fired or reassigned. The agency underwent a comprehensive review and reorganization aimed at addressing the failures that had allowed Elisa to be tortured to death while under their theoretical supervision. Elisa's law was passed in the wake of her death, mandating background checks for all individuals seeking custody of children. The law required courts to consider a parent's history of drug abuse, domestic violence, and prior child welfare involvement when making custody determinations. It represented a recognition that biological parenthood alone shouldn't determine custody when there is evidence of unfitness. But no law could bring back Elisa Izquierdo. No reform could erase the months of torture she endured. No conviction could balance the scales of justice for a 6-year-old girl who died begging for help that never came. The reforms might save future children, but they came too late for Elisa. Elisa loved to draw, creating colorful pictures that her teachers saved and that later became evidence of a vibrant personality crushed by abuse. She loved music and would hum or sing quietly when she felt safe. She had dreams of becoming a teacher herself someday, wanting to help other children learn and grow. These details of her personality, shared by those who knew her during her time with her father and her early months at school, made her death all the more heartbreaking. Instead of growing up to pursue her dreams, she became a cautionary tale about what happens when systems fail and mothers become monsters. Her name became attached to legislation. Her case became a catalyst for reform. Her death became a turning point in how New York City approached child protection. But she should have just been allowed to be a little girl who grew up to become whoever she wanted to be. Awilda Lopez was released from prison in 2012 after serving her minimum sentence of 15 years. The decision to grant her parole was controversial, with many arguing that someone who had tortured a child to death should never be released. Advocates for Elisa's memory protested the release. But under New York law, she was eligible for parole after serving her minimum sentence, and the parole board determined she had been sufficiently rehabilitated to be released. Her release doesn't change what happened to Elisa. It doesn't erase the months of torture. It doesn't undo the failure of systems to protect a vulnerable child. It doesn't restore the life that was stolen. Elisa Izquierdo remains forever 6 years old, frozen in time as the little girl who loved to draw and dreamed of becoming a teacher, whose life was cut short by the woman who should have been her protector. The reforms implemented in Elisa's name, background checks, better caseworker training, modified custody standards, have potentially saved other children. Child welfare professionals cite Elisa's case as a turning point in how New York approaches child protection. But the tragedy remains that it took her death to prompt changes that should have been in place all along. 27 years after her death, Elisa Izquierdo is still remembered. Teachers who knew her still speak about her with sadness. Child welfare advocates invoke her name when discussing needed reforms. Her case appears in textbooks and training materials for social workers. And her death continues to serve as a reminder that protecting children requires vigilance, resources, and a willingness to act decisively when children are in danger. Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Case 5, Stephanie Castillo. Date of crime, August 9, 2016. Court County, Bronx County. Charged, multiple counts including murder. In the early morning hours of August 9, 2016, residents of an apartment building on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx were awakened by an anguished scream that cut through the normal urban nighttime sounds. The scream was primal, filled with a distress that suggested something terrible had occurred. When police arrived at the apartment in response to a 911 call, they discovered a scene that would haunt even veteran investigators who had seen decades of crime scenes. 2 newborn twin boys, dead in a bathtub, their tiny bodies still warm but unmistakably lifeless. Stephanie Castillo, a 23-year-old woman, was found in the apartment in a state of extreme distress. She was crying, barely coherent, and appeared to be in medical distress herself. Paramedics evaluated her and determined she had recently given birth. The apartment showed signs of a birth having taken place, blood, medical waste, and the aftermath of labor. But there were no living babies, only the 2 small bodies in the bathtub. The investigation that followed quickly revealed a tragedy born of desperation, secrecy, and ultimately, violence against the most vulnerable victims imaginable, infants who had drawn breath for only hours. Detectives working the case faced the difficult task of determining exactly what had happened in those early morning hours and whether the deaths were the result of panic, mental illness, or deliberate murder. The medical examiner determined that Castillo had given birth to the twins alone in her apartment. Based on the evidence at the scene and Stephanie's own statements, she had not sought medical assistance during the pregnancy or labor. She had concealed the pregnancy from her family, who lived in the same building just floors away. Her pregnancy had progressed to full term without anyone in her immediate circle knowing she was pregnant, a fact that raised questions about her social isolation and the relationship dynamics in her family. Concealing a pregnancy for 9 months requires deliberate effort and often indicates deep fear, shame, or psychological distress. Stephanie had worn loose clothing, avoided situations where her pregnancy might be noticed, and apparently never sought prenatal care. The lack of prenatal care meant she had no medical support, no preparation for childbirth, and no opportunity for medical professionals to identify any risks or offer help. After delivering the babies alone, an experience that must have been frightening and painful without medical support, Stephanie faced a choice. She could have called 911 for medical help. She could have walked down the hall and told her family what had happened. She could have wrapped the babies in blankets and taken them to a hospital or fire station under New York's safe haven law. Instead, she chose a different path, one that ended with 2 newborns dead. Evidence suggested the twins were born alive. This determination was based on several factors examined by the medical examiner. The babies were full-term, well-developed, and showed signs of having breathed air after birth. Their lungs had expanded with air, a key indicator that they had lived outside the womb. They appeared to be healthy babies who, with proper medical care, should have had every chance at life. But their mother placed them in water in the bathtub. The exact sequence of events became a subject of forensic investigation, with experts examining every detail of the scene to understand what had happened. The medical examiner conducted detailed autopsies, looking for evidence of drowning, signs of when the babies died relative to birth, and any other factors that might explain their deaths. The findings indicated that the cause of death was drowning. The babies had water in their lungs consistent with drowning after birth. The medical examiner determined that they had been placed in water while alive, that they had breathed in water, and that this had caused their deaths. This wasn't a case of stillbirth or immediate death from complications. These were live births followed by drowning. The question for investigators and prosecutors was whether this was infanticide, deliberate murder of the newborns, or whether Stephanie had experienced some kind of break with reality due to the trauma of giving birth alone, panic, or mental illness. Understanding her state of mind was crucial both for charging decisions and for ultimately prosecuting the case. The case raised difficult questions about access to reproductive health care, about the pressures young women face regarding unplanned pregnancy, about the resources available to new mothers in crisis, and about the complex interplay of mental health, social support, and criminal responsibility. But regardless of the circumstances that led Stephanie Castillo to conceal her pregnancy, the deaths of her newborn sons remained acts of violence that the law could not excuse. Investigators worked to understand Castillo's background and state of mind. They interviewed family members, who expressed shock at learning about the pregnancy and births. Her mother, who lived in the same building, had not known her daughter was pregnant. Friends and acquaintances reported no awareness of the pregnancy. Stephanie had apparently told no one about her situation. She had no apparent history of violence or criminal behavior. Her record was clean, no arrests, no history of mental health treatment that investigators could find, no prior involvement with child protective services. By all accounts from those who knew her, she was a young woman facing an overwhelming situation she felt unable to manage. But overwhelming situations don't justify infanticide. They require intervention, support, and compassion, extended to the vulnerable babies, not at their expense. The law recognizes that desperation, fear, and even mental illness can impair judgment, but it also maintains that society has an obligation to protect the most vulnerable, including newborns. New York State has robust safe haven laws specifically designed to provide options for mothers who feel unable to care for their newborns. These laws allow mothers to surrender newborns safely and legally at designated locations with no questions asked and no criminal prosecution. Hospitals, firehouses, and police stations all accept newborns under these provisions. Stephanie Castillo's apartment was located in a densely populated urban area with multiple safe haven locations within easy walking distance. She could have walked her newborn sons to any of these locations and left them to be cared for. The babies would have been taken into the child welfare system, placed in foster care or adopted, and given a chance at life. Stephanie would have faced no legal consequences for surrendering them under the safe haven law. But instead, she chose a path that ended 2 lives before they had truly begun. Understanding why she made this choice becomes crucial for both the legal process and for identifying how to prevent similar tragedies. Was it panic? Mental illness? A complete lack of awareness about safe haven options? Fear of consequences? The investigation aimed to answer these questions. The prosecution of Stephanie Castillo proceeded through the Bronx court system under intense media scrutiny. She faced multiple charges including murder, reflecting the serious view prosecutors took of the deaths of 2 newborns. The legal process had to balance accountability with an understanding of the complex factors that lead to such tragedies. Defense attorneys would likely argue several possible mitigating factors. They might present evidence of Stephanie's mental state, arguing that the trauma of giving birth alone, combined with possible postpartum mental health issues, impaired her judgment to the point where she couldn't form the criminal intent required for murder. They might argue for lesser charges reflecting heat of passion or temporary insanity rather than deliberate murder. They might present expert testimony about postpartum psychosis, a rare but serious condition that can occur shortly after giving birth and can include delusions, hallucinations, and severely impaired judgment. While postpartum depression is relatively common, affecting many new mothers to some degree, postpartum psychosis is much rarer but far more serious and can lead to behavior the mother would never engage in otherwise. They might also argue about Stephanie's age, her lack of support, her apparent social isolation, and the desperation she must have felt facing motherhood of twins without resources or support. These arguments wouldn't excuse the deaths, but might provide context that could affect sentencing even if she were convicted. But prosecutors maintain that regardless of mental state or circumstances, killing newborn babies is murder, and the law must hold people accountable for taking innocent lives. They would argue that Stephanie had options: safe haven surrender, calling for help, telling her family, and that choosing instead to place live babies in water until they drowned was a deliberate act of violence. The case devastated the local community in the Bronx. Neighbors who lived in the same building struggled to comprehend how this could happen so close to home, in an apartment just down the hall or up the stairs from their own homes. The building where the deaths occurred was home to dozens of families, many with children of their own. The knowledge that 2 babies had been killed there created a sense of unease and sorrow. Mental health advocates pointed to the need for better support for new mothers and better education about options available to women facing unplanned pregnancies. They emphasized that postpartum mental health issues are real, serious, and treatable, but require early identification and intervention. They called for better screening for pregnant women and new mothers, more accessible mental health services, and reduced stigma around seeking help. Child welfare experts emphasized the importance of education about safe haven laws. Despite these laws being in effect in New York and most other states, many people remain unaware of them or unclear about how they work. Experts called for better public education campaigns to ensure that every pregnant woman and new mother knows that safe, legal options exist for surrendering a baby they feel unable to care for. But at the center of it all were 2 tiny victims who never got a chance at life. They were born alive, breathed air, and experienced a few minutes or hours in this world before their mother ended their lives. They never felt sunshine on their faces. The legal proceedings against Stephanie Castillo highlighted the difficult balance courts must strike between prosecuting serious crimes and understanding the human factors that contribute to tragedy. The criminal justice system must hold people accountable for their actions while also recognizing that human behavior is complex and influenced by circumstances, mental health, and social factors. Prosecutors had to decide what charges to bring: first-degree murder requiring proof of premeditation, second-degree murder requiring intent to kill, manslaughter reflecting reckless behavior or heat of passion, or other charges reflecting different levels of culpability. These decisions would be based on evidence about Stephanie's state of mind, her actions in those crucial hours after giving birth, and expert opinion about her mental capacity. For the prosecutors and investigators working the case, it was straightforward in one sense. 2 babies died at their mother's hands, and justice demanded accountability. But it was complicated by questions about mental illness, desperation, and the extent to which someone in Stephanie's situation could form the criminal intent required for the most serious charges. The case also raised broader questions about society's responsibility to ensure that pregnant women have access to health care, mental health services, and support systems that might prevent such tragedies. While individuals must be held accountable for their actions, preventing future tragedies requires addressing systemic issues around reproductive health care, mental health services, and social support. As the legal process continued, the Bronx community grappled with the tragedy. Vigils were held for the unnamed twins. Community leaders called for better support services for young mothers. Healthcare providers in the area increased efforts to reach pregnant women who might not be receiving prenatal care. And many people simply struggled to understand how something so tragic could happen. The deaths of Stephanie Castillo's newborn twin sons represent a particular kind of tragedy, one where the victims never had any chance to advocate for themselves, where they died within hours of birth, where their entire existence was measured in minutes rather than years. They deserved protection from the moment of birth, deserved to be cared for rather than killed, deserved a chance at life that was stolen before it truly began. If you're finding value in these thoroughly researched cases from True Crime Silent Files, please show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to our channel. We're dedicated to bringing you verified true crime stories presented with accuracy, depth, and respect for the victims and their families. Case 6. Gloria Asamoah. Date of crime: May 3, 2019. Court County, Bronx County. Indicted, murder charges. When emergency responders arrived at an apartment building in the Bronx on May 3, 2019, they found Gloria Asamoah unconscious alongside her 2 infant children, twin babies who were not breathing. The initial assessment of the scene appeared to suggest a tragedy, perhaps a case of carbon monoxide poisoning or some other environmental hazard that had affected the entire family simultaneously. The first responders worked quickly, administering oxygen and checking for environmental dangers that might have caused all 3 people in the apartment to lose consciousness. But as the investigation unfolded over the subsequent hours and days, what initially appeared to be a tragic accident would reveal something far more sinister. The scene that emergency workers encountered that May morning would ultimately be determined to be a crime scene, the site of a double infanticide followed by an attempted suicide. The twins, a boy and a girl less than 1 year old, were pronounced dead at the scene despite the desperate efforts of paramedics to revive them. Their small bodies showed no immediate signs of trauma that would be visible to first responders, no obvious injuries that would explain their deaths. Gloria Asamoah was successfully revived and transported to a hospital in critical condition. She remained unconscious for some time, preventing immediate questioning by investigators. As investigators processed the scene more carefully, looking for environmental hazards or other explanations for 3 people losing consciousness simultaneously, they found no carbon monoxide, no gas leaks, no toxic substances in the air. The apartment's ventilation systems were functioning normally. There were no obvious environmental causes that would explain the deaths and Gloria's unconsciousness. Medical examiners began their work on the babies' bodies, conducting thorough autopsies to determine the cause of death. The findings were devastating and pointed to deliberate violence rather than environmental causes or natural death. Both infants showed signs consistent with smothering, petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, foam in the airways, and other indicators that they had been deprived of oxygen through external means rather than environmental factors. The medical evidence was clear and disturbing. Both twins had been smothered. This was not accidental suffocation from unsafe sleeping arrangements, not sudden infant death syndrome, not an environmental tragedy. Someone had deliberately placed pressure over these babies' tiny faces, sustained long enough to stop their breathing and cause their deaths. The act required deliberate pressure maintained for several minutes, long enough for the babies to struggle for air, long enough for them to lose consciousness, long enough to ensure they would not survive. All evidence pointed to the mother as the perpetrator. Gloria had been alone in the apartment with the twins. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else had been present. The timeline established by investigators, building management, and neighbor observations confirmed that Gloria and the babies had been alone in the locked apartment during the time frame when the deaths occurred. The investigation revealed important context about Gloria Asamoah's life and circumstances. She had immigrated from Ghana and was living in the Bronx with her children. Immigration records and interviews with community members helped investigators understand her background. She had come to the United States seeking better opportunities, working to build a life for herself and her family in a new country. To neighbors who knew her casually, she seemed like any other struggling mother trying to make ends meet in an expensive city. The Bronx neighborhood where she lived was home to many immigrant families, people working multiple jobs to afford rent and provide for their children. Gloria appeared to fit this pattern, a mother juggling the demands of caring for infant twins while trying to manage the economic and social challenges of immigrant life in New York City. But behind the facade of normal struggle, something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators worked to understand what had happened in Gloria's life leading up to that May morning. They interviewed family members, neighbors, community contacts, and anyone who had interacted with Gloria in the weeks and months before the twins' deaths. The investigation revealed that Gloria had been experiencing significant mental health challenges. The exact nature and severity of these challenges became a focus of both the criminal investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings. Friends and community members reported that Gloria had seemed increasingly stressed, overwhelmed, and withdrawn in the period leading up to the tragedy. Financial pressures appeared to be significant. Raising infant twins is expensive under the best circumstances: diapers, formula, clothing, medical care, and the opportunity cost of time spent on childcare rather than paid work. For a single mother in the Bronx without extensive family support or financial resources, these pressures can become overwhelming. Social isolation also appeared to be a factor. Immigrants often face particular challenges in building support networks in a new country. Language barriers, cultural differences, lack of extended family nearby, and the demands of work can all contribute to isolation. For new mothers, social isolation is a recognized risk factor for mental health challenges, including postpartum depression and anxiety. The demands of caring for infant twins had created what appeared to be a pressure cooker situation for Gloria. Twins are exponentially more challenging than a single infant. Two babies with different rhythms, twice the feedings, twice the diaper changes, double the sleep deprivation. Parents of twins often describe feeling overwhelmed even with strong support systems. For a mother struggling with mental health issues, financial stress, and social isolation, the demands may have become unbearable. But mental health struggles, financial pressures, and social isolation, while they might explain a state of mind, do not excuse the smothering of two helpless babies. Understanding why something happened is not the same as excusing what happened. Society has an obligation to provide support for struggling parents, but parents retain an obligation not to harm their children regardless of how overwhelmed they feel. The medical evidence demonstrated that both twins had been smothered deliberately. The act of smothering requires sustained pressure over a baby's face. It's not instantaneous. Each second those babies struggled for air, their mother could have stopped. She could have pulled away her hands, or the pillow, or whatever she used to block their airways. She could have called for help. She could have walked out of the apartment and told someone she was having thoughts of harming her children. But she didn't. She maintained the pressure until both babies stopped breathing, until both babies lost consciousness, until both babies died. After smothering her children, evidence suggested Gloria attempted to take her own life, creating the appearance of a tragedy that had befallen the entire family rather than a crime she had committed. The exact method of her suicide attempt became part of the evidence in the case. She appeared to have consumed some substance or combination of substances intended to be lethal, but she survived, either because the dose was insufficient or because emergency responders arrived in time to save her. The survival of the person who commits a murder-suicide is relatively rare, but does occur. In such cases, prosecutors face decisions about how to handle a defendant who was clearly attempting to die alongside their victims. The attempted suicide can be evidence of mental state, either showing remorse and inability to face consequences, or demonstrating the depth of mental illness or desperation that led to the crime. The Bronx District Attorney's Office indicted Gloria Asamoah on murder charges. The decision to charge murder rather than lesser offenses reflected the view that deliberately smothering two babies constitutes the most serious category of homicide. The indictment initiated a legal process that would involve extensive evaluation of Gloria's mental competency and state of mind. The case proceeded through the legal system with all the complexity that comes from questions of mental competency and state of mind. When a defendant's mental health is at issue, the legal process can become extended and involve multiple experts evaluating the defendant to determine several key questions. Is the defendant competent to stand trial? Did the defendant understand what they were doing at the time of the crime? Did mental illness prevent the defendant from forming the intent required for murder? Defense attorneys would likely argue that Gloria was suffering from postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis, conditions that can severely impair judgment and create dangerous situations for mothers and children. Postpartum psychosis is particularly serious. It's a rare condition affecting approximately 1 in 1,000 new mothers, characterized by delusions, hallucinations, severe mood swings, and in extreme cases, thoughts of harming oneself or one's children. Mental health experts would evaluate whether Gloria's actions were the product of postpartum psychosis or severe depression that impaired her judgment to the point where she could not form criminal intent. If so, Her defense might argue for a verdict of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, which would result in psychiatric treatment rather than imprisonment. But prosecutors maintained that regardless of mental state, the deliberate smothering of 2 babies constituted murder. Even if Gloria was experiencing mental illness, the question for a jury would be whether that mental illness prevented her from knowing what she was doing or knowing it was wrong. The law recognizes mental illness as a factor in criminal cases, but it also recognizes society's need to hold people accountable for taking innocent lives and to protect public safety. The twins who died that day never got to celebrate their first birthday. They never spoke their first words, never took their first steps, never experienced the milestones of childhood. Their lives were measured in months, cut short by the woman who brought them into the world. They had names, though these were not widely publicized to protect privacy. They had personalities beginning to emerge. One might have been more active, the other calmer. One might have smiled more readily, the other been more serious. Those individual traits were just beginning to appear when their lives ended. The case highlighted ongoing challenges in identifying and supporting mothers in crisis. Postpartum depression affects a significant percentage of new mothers. Estimates range from 10 to 20% depending on the study and how depression is measured. Most mothers experiencing postpartum depression never harm their children, but the condition does increase risk, particularly when combined with other stressors. Postpartum psychosis, while much rarer, is a medical emergency that requires immediate intervention. The condition can develop rapidly, sometimes within days of giving birth. Symptoms include delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, severe mood swings, and thoughts of harming oneself or one's baby. Medical professionals emphasize that these conditions are treatable with appropriate psychiatric care, but early identification and intervention are crucial. The tragedy in Gloria Asamoah's case was that if she was experiencing postpartum mental health issues, she apparently didn't receive the help she needed before the situation became deadly. Whether this was because she didn't recognize her symptoms as a medical issue, because she lacked access to mental health care, because cultural factors prevented her from seeking help, or for other reasons, the result was the same. 2 babies died who should have lived. For Gloria Asamoah's twins, intervention came too late. By the time anyone knew something was wrong, they were already gone, smothered in their own home by the hands that should have held them safely, protected them fiercely, and nurtured them through the vulnerable months of infancy. The deaths of Gloria Asamoah's twins remind us that maternal mental health is not a luxury, it's a life or death issue. If you're a new mother struggling with overwhelming thoughts, depression, or anxiety, please reach out for help. If you know a new mother who seems isolated, overwhelmed, or not herself, check on her. Offer concrete help. These conditions are treatable. Help is available. You don't have to suffer alone, and your children need you to get help. If this case has affected you or made you think about the mothers in your community who might be struggling, please share this video to raise awareness. Hit that like button to help this important content reach more people. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how we can better support mothers in crisis. And subscribe to True Crime Silent Files for more in-depth investigations that not only examine crimes, but also explore how we can prevent future tragedies. Your engagement helps spread awareness that could save lives. Case 7. Karla Espinal. Date of crime: June 27, 2020. Court County, Kings County, Brooklyn. Charged: murder and manslaughter. In the Bushwick neighborhood of Brooklyn, on a summer day when children should have been playing outside and enjoying vacation from school, 6-year-old Elisa Espinal was found unresponsive in a bathtub on June 27, 2020. The initial call to emergency services suggested a drowning accident, a tragic but unfortunately common occurrence that happens despite parents' best efforts to supervise children around water. When paramedics and police arrived at the apartment on a residential street in Bushwick, they responded with the urgency and professionalism required for a potential drowning victim. They immediately began resuscitation efforts, working to revive the little girl whose body had been pulled from the bathtub. But as they worked and as investigators began examining the scene, inconsistencies emerged that transformed what appeared to be a tragic accident into a potential homicide investigation. Karla Espinal, Elisa's mother, told first responders that she had found her daughter in the bathtub after leaving her alone briefly. Her account suggested that Elisa had been playing or bathing and had somehow slipped under the water and drowned while her mother was occupied elsewhere in the apartment. This type of accident, while tragic, does occur. Children can drown in just inches of water in a matter of minutes if left unsupervised. But the timeline didn't make sense to investigators. Medical evidence and the condition of Elisa's body raised questions about when and how she had entered the water. The apartment's layout and the activities Karla claimed to have been doing during the time Elisa allegedly drowned didn't align with the physical evidence. Neighbors' statements about sounds they heard or didn't hear contradicted elements of Karla's account. Most significantly, the medical examiner's findings indicated that this was not a simple accidental drowning. The pattern of injuries and the medical evidence didn't support the narrative of a child accidentally slipping underwater. Instead, the evidence pointed to something more sinister: homicide by drowning. The investigation revealed that Elisa had been subjected to abuse in the home prior to the day of her death. Records showed previous incidents that had raised concerns among teachers, neighbors, and others who interacted with the family. There had been reports to Child Protective Services about possible abuse or neglect, though apparently not recent enough or severe enough to have triggered removal of the child from the home. Teachers at Elisa's school had documented concerns over the months leading up to her death. In the COVID-19 pandemic era when this death occurred, schools had been closed for extended periods and were operating on modified schedules, which meant that one of the most important systems for identifying child abuse, daily observation by teachers, had been disrupted. When Elisa did attend school in person, teachers noticed things that concerned them. They saw bruises that Elisa couldn't or wouldn't explain adequately. They observed behavior consistent with trauma, withdrawal, fearfulness, difficulty concentrating, or alternatively, acting out in ways that suggested stress at home. They documented times when Elisa arrived at school without adequate food or appropriate clothing for the weather. These observations were reported through appropriate channels, but the intervention that resulted was apparently insufficient to protect Elisa from whatever was happening in her home. On that June day in 2020, something escalated beyond the usual pattern of abuse that Elisa had apparently been experiencing. The exact sequence of events became a subject of intensive investigation and would ultimately be a key issue in the prosecution of the case. What led to Elisa being in the bathtub? What happened while she was there? How long was she underwater? Was she held under, or did she drown while unconscious from other injuries? The medical examiner's findings indicated that Elisa had been held underwater. This determination was based on several factors: the pattern of injuries on her body, evidence of defensive wounds or struggle, the presence or absence of water in the lungs and patterns consistent with drowning while conscious versus drowning while already unconscious, and other forensic evidence that distinguished between accidental drowning and homicide. This was not a case of a child slipping in the bath while playing. This was not an accident resulting from momentary inattention. The evidence pointed to homicide, specifically to drowning inflicted by another person who held a 6-year-old child underwater until she died. Karla Espinal was arrested and charged with murder and manslaughter. The decision to charge both murder and manslaughter gave prosecutors flexibility in what they could prove at trial. Murder charges require proving intent to kill, while manslaughter charges can be based on reckless behavior that results in death even without specific intent to kill. By charging both, prosecutors preserved options depending on what evidence proved most compelling. The prosecution built a case arguing that Karla had deliberately drowned her daughter, possibly in a moment of rage or as an escalation of ongoing abuse. They would present the medical evidence showing that Elisa had been held underwater. They would introduce evidence of prior abuse suggesting a pattern of violence. They would challenge the credibility of Karla's account of what happened, pointing out inconsistencies and contradictions. The defense would likely argue accident or diminished capacity, that Elisa's death, while tragic, was not the result of deliberate murder. Defense attorneys might present evidence about Karla's mental state, arguing that stress, mental illness, or other factors impaired her judgment. They might argue that Elisa's death resulted from excessive discipline that went too far rather than an intent to kill. But the physical evidence told a story of violence, not misfortune. A 6-year-old child doesn't drown in a bathtub by accident when a parent is present. The medical evidence of being held underwater contradicted any narrative of accidental death, and the prior evidence of abuse suggested a pattern of violence that culminated in Jalisa's death. 6-year-old Jalisa Espinal was in kindergarten or first grade, at an age when children are learning to read, making friends, discovering their interests and personalities. She should have been excited about summer vacation, playing with friends, enjoying the freedom of days without school. Teachers described her as sweet and eager to please when she was in a safe environment, though they had noticed she sometimes came to school withdrawn or with unexplained marks. Jalisa enjoyed playing with dolls according to those who knew her. She liked watching cartoons and animated movies. She was learning to draw and color, creating pictures that showed developing motor skills and creativity. She was a child with preferences, personality, and potential, all stolen from her on a June day in Brooklyn. The case proceeded during the COVID-19 pandemic, a time when many families were under extraordinary stress that may have contributed to increased domestic violence and child abuse. Schools were closed, meaning children lost daily contact with teachers who might notice abuse. Social services were operating at reduced capacity due to pandemic restrictions. The usual safety nets and observation points that might catch child abuse were disrupted by pandemic lockdowns and social distancing requirements. Economic stress from pandemic-related job losses affected many families. Social isolation from inability to gather with friends and family support networks took a psychological toll. Parents were suddenly responsible for childcare and education simultaneously while working from home or dealing with unemployment. Mental health services were harder to access as many providers shifted to telehealth or reduced hours. But even in that difficult context, even acknowledging the unprecedented stress of the pandemic period, the drowning of a 6-year-old girl in her own bathtub demanded accountability. Understanding that circumstances were difficult doesn't excuse violence against children. It may provide context for why stress is increased, but it doesn't justify killing a child. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office pursued the charges vigorously despite the challenges of prosecuting a case during a pandemic, when court proceedings were slowed and jury trials were delayed. For prosecutors, the case was about a fundamental violation of the parent-child relationship and about justice for a 6-year-old who died a terrifying death. As the legal process unfolded, the Bushwick community mourned Jalisa. In a neighborhood where many families knew the challenges of raising children in difficult circumstances, where economic stress and overcrowded housing were common realities, Jalisa's death resonated deeply. Neighbors who barely knew the family felt the loss. Community organizations held vigils, and child welfare advocates once again pointed to the gaps in a system that failed to protect a vulnerable child. The bathtub where Jalisa died should have been a place where a 6-year-old played with toys, learned to wash her own hair, and maybe practiced swimming motions in anticipation of someday swimming in a real pool. Instead, it became the site of her death, a death that investigation and prosecution would determine was no accident, but rather a homicide that ended a young life full of potential. The pandemic had already stolen so much from children: months of normal schooling, birthday parties, time with extended family, developmental experiences that happened through social interaction. For Jalisa, the pandemic era ultimately cost her everything when the systems that might have protected her were disrupted, and the stresses of that period may have contributed to the violence that killed her. Jalisa Espinal's death during the pandemic reminds us that child abuse doesn't stop during crises. In fact, it often increases when families are isolated and stressed. If you're a neighbor who hears concerning sounds from another apartment, don't assume someone else will call. Make the report yourself. If you're a teacher or healthcare worker who sees signs of abuse, document everything and follow through on mandated reporting even when systems are disrupted. And if you're a parent feeling overwhelmed to the point of rage, step away from your child and call a crisis hotline before you do something you can't undo. This tragic case shows why we need to stay vigilant in protecting children, especially during times of crisis. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share this video to raise awareness. Leave a comment about how communities can better support families under stress. And subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. We're committed to not just telling these stories, but to helping prevent future tragedies through education and awareness. Your subscription helps us continue this important work. Case 8. Waneta, Ethel Hoyt. Date of crimes: 1965 to 1971. Court County, Tioga County. Convicted, second-degree murder, 5 counts. For more than 2 decades, the deaths of Waneta Hoyt's 5 children were considered a medical mystery, tragic examples of sudden infant death syndrome claiming multiple children in one family. The Hoyt case was cited in medical journals as evidence of possible genetic factors in SIDS. Doctors sympathized with a mother who had suffered the unimaginable loss of all her biological children. Medical researchers studied the family history looking for clues that might help prevent SIDS in other families. But the truth, when it finally emerged in the 1990s, was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Between 1965 and 1971, in the small town of Berkshire in upstate New York, Waneta Hoyt's 5 biological children died one by one, each at just weeks or months old. The deaths occurred over a span of 6 years, each one documented as sudden infant death syndrome or attributed to similar unexplained causes of infant death. Each time, Waneta reported finding the baby not breathing. Each time, medical professionals and investigators accepted her account. And each time, another tiny life was lost. The first to die was Eric, in January 1965, at less than 3 months old. Baby Eric stopped breathing according to his mother's account, and despite efforts to revive him, he died. The death was attributed to SIDS, a diagnosis that in the 1960s was even less understood than it is today. SIDS was essentially a diagnosis of exclusion. When a baby died and no other cause could be determined, it was often classified as SIDS. The second child, Julie, died in September 1968 at just 53 days old. Once again, Waneta reported finding her baby daughter not breathing. Medical examiners found no obvious cause of death and attributed it to SIDS. While losing 2 children to SIDS was unusual, medical knowledge at the time suggested it might be possible, particularly if there were genetic factors involved. James, the third child, died in September 1970 at 2.5 months old. Then Molly died later that same year, also at just 2 months old. The deaths of 2 more children in the same year raised more questions among medical professionals. How could one family lose 4 children to SIDS? The statistical probability was extraordinarily low, but the medical understanding of SIDS at the time allowed for the possibility that some families might have genetic predispositions that put multiple children at risk. Finally, Noah died in July 1971 at just 2 months old. He was the 5th and final child Waneta Hoyt gave birth to, and the 5th to die in infancy. All 5 deaths had been attributed to SIDS or similar unexplained infant death. The Hoyt family became a case study in medical journals, cited as an example of how SIDS could affect multiple children in one family. The sheer improbability of 5 children in one family dying of SIDS should have raised immediate alarms. But in the medical and investigative understanding of that era, such clusters were thought possible if extraordinarily rare. Medical researchers were interested in the family from a genetic standpoint, wondering what factors might make the Hoyt children particularly vulnerable to SIDS. No one seriously investigated the possibility that these were not natural deaths, but murders. For over 2 decades after the last child's death, Waneta lived with her husband Timothy in their small upstate New York community. They eventually adopted a child who survived to adulthood, and the family lived what appeared to be a normal life. Waneta was known in the community as a woman who had suffered terrible tragedy, losing all her biological children. People sympathized with her loss and admired her resilience in adopting and raising another child despite her painful history. But in the late 1980s and early 1990s, medical understanding of SIDS evolved significantly. Researchers began to recognize that some cases attributed to SIDS were actually homicides, infants who had been smothered or suffocated rather than dying of natural causes. The medical community developed better diagnostic criteria for distinguishing true SIDS from imposed suffocation. And cases that had been accepted as SIDS in earlier decades came under new scrutiny with more sophisticated understanding. The Hoyt case, which had been cited in medical literature as an example of familial SIDS, came under this new scrutiny. Researchers and investigators began to question whether 5 SIDS deaths in one family could actually be coincidental. Statistical analysis suggested the probability was astronomically low, so low that murder became a more likely explanation than natural causes. In 1994, more than 2 decades after the death of the last Hoyt child, investigators reopened the cases. The decision to reinvestigate was based on the evolving medical understanding of SIDS and the statistical improbability of the Hoyt deaths being natural. Investigators from the New York State Police approached Waneta for questioning about the deaths that had occurred so many years before. What happened next stunned the medical community, law enforcement, and the small upstate New York community where the Hoyts lived. After hours of interrogation, Waneta Hoyt confessed to murdering all 5 of her children by smothering them. The confession, recorded and documented, was detailed and chilling. According to her confession, Waneta had become frustrated with crying babies and responded by placing pillows or towels over their faces until they stopped breathing. She described the acts in matter-of-fact terms, without apparent emotion or recognition of the enormity of what she was admitting. She said she had killed each child when they became too demanding, when their crying irritated her, when the stress of infant care became overwhelming. After each death, according to her confession, she waited a period of time before calling for help. This delay ensured the babies would be truly dead, beyond revival, before anyone else saw them. Then she would discover the baby not breathing and call for help, presenting herself as a distraught mother who had found her infant inexplicably dead. The confession was controversial from the moment it became public. Waneta quickly recanted, claiming it had been coerced through inappropriate interrogation techniques. Her defense team argued that the interrogation had been manipulative, that Waneta had limited education and intellectual capacity, and that she had been pressured into confessing to crimes she didn't commit. They characterized her as a vulnerable woman who had been psychologically manipulated by experienced interrogators into making false admissions. Defense attorneys presented expert testimony about false confessions, explaining how certain interrogation techniques can lead people, particularly those who are intellectually limited, socially compliant, or psychologically vulnerable, to confess to crimes they didn't commit. They argued that Waneta's confession should be suppressed as involuntary and unreliable. But prosecutors maintained that the confession was voluntary and that it was corroborated by medical evidence that had been overlooked or misinterpreted in the original investigations. They argued that with modern understanding of SIDS and suffocation, the evidence clearly pointed to smothering rather than natural death. The trial in 1995 became a battle of experts that captured national attention. The case raised profound questions about medical certainty, the reliability of confessions, and how the criminal justice system should handle cold cases being reopened decades later based on evolving scientific understanding. Medical examiners testified that re-examination of the available evidence from the original deaths suggested the children had been smothered, not died of SIDS. They explained that certain findings in the autopsy reports, which had been interpreted as consistent with SIDS in the 1960s and 70s, were actually more consistent with suffocation when viewed with modern medical knowledge. They described petechial hemorrhages, foam in airways, and other signs that could indicate smothering. The statistical improbability of 5 SIDS deaths in one family was presented as powerful evidence. Expert witnesses testified that the probability of 5 children in one family dying of true SIDS was so infinitesimally small, estimated at something like 1 in 10 million or less, that alternative explanations became much more probable than coincidental natural death. And Waneta's confession, despite her recantation, formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors argued that the level of detail in her confession, the consistency of her account across multiple tellings, and the fact that she had provided information that matched medical evidence all pointed to the confession being truthful rather than coerced. The defense presented a completely different narrative. They portrayed Waneta as a woman of limited intelligence who had been targeted by investigators looking to close old cases. They argued that modern experts were second-guessing medical determinations made decades earlier by competent physicians who had examined the babies shortly after death. They suggested that statistical probabilities, while interesting, didn't prove murder. Improbable things do happen. Most importantly, they attacked the confession. They presented expert testimony about false confessions and the techniques that can produce them. They argued that Waneta, after hours of interrogation, had simply told investigators what they wanted to hear in order to end the questioning. They pointed out that she had recanted immediately and consistently maintained her innocence thereafter. The jury faced an extraordinarily difficult decision. Could they convict someone of murder based primarily on a confession that had been recanted for crimes that occurred more than 20 years earlier, when the only direct evidence was that confession and statistical/medical analysis of old records? The weight of this decision, potentially sending someone to prison for life based on such evidence, was immense. After deliberating for several days, the jury convicted Waneta Hoyt of 5 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict was controversial and would remain so. Some believe justice had finally been served for 5 babies who had been murdered and whose deaths had been misclassified for decades. Others believed Waneta was a victim of overzealous prosecution, false confession, and statistical reasoning that wrongly convicted an innocent woman who had suffered the genuine tragedy of losing 5 children to natural causes. She was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison, effectively a life sentence given her age. The judge, in imposing the sentence, spoke about the 5 innocent lives lost and the betrayal inherent in a mother killing her babies. But the judge also acknowledged the controversy surrounding the case and the difficult questions it raised. The verdict and sentence did not end the debate. Waneta Hoyt died in prison in August 1998 at age 51, still maintaining her innocence. She had served less than 4 years of her sentence when she died of pancreatic cancer. Her husband, Timothy, never wavered in his belief that she was wrongly convicted. He maintained until his own death that Waneta was innocent, that their children had died of natural causes, and that she had been coerced into a false confession. The case had far-reaching implications beyond one family's tragedy. Medical researchers removed the Hoyt case from SIDS literature, acknowledging that what had been cited as an example of familial SIDS was actually a case of serial infanticide. The case was now referenced as an example of how SIDS diagnoses could mask murder. Investigators across the country began re-examining suspicious infant deaths that had been classified as SIDS. Some cases were reopened and reinvestigated. In some instances, new prosecutions resulted. The medical community became more aware that what appears to be SIDS can sometimes mask infanticide, leading to more careful investigation of multiple infant deaths in families. The case also contributed to ongoing debates about interrogation techniques and false confessions. Legal scholars and defense attorneys cited the Hoyt case as an example of why confessions, particularly in historical cases, should be treated with skepticism. Changes were made in some jurisdictions to interrogation procedures to reduce the risk of false confessions. 5 children, Eric, Julie, James, Molly, and Noah, died in their infancy between 1965 and 1971. Whether one believes Waneta Hoyt smothered them or that they died of natural causes, the tragedy remains undeniable. 5 babies who never grew up, never experienced childhood, never had a chance at life. If Waneta did kill them, as the jury determined, then these were 5 murders that went undetected for more than 2 decades because medical understanding at the time couldn't distinguish suffocation from SIDS. 5 babies were smothered by their mother when she became frustrated with their crying and demands. 5 times, she held a pillow or towel over a tiny face until the struggling stopped. 5 times, she waited to ensure death before calling for help. And 5 times, the deaths were accepted as natural rather than investigated as potential homicides. If Waneta was innocent, as she and her supporters maintained, then the tragedy is different but equally profound. A mother who genuinely lost 5 children to an unexplained medical condition was then wrongly convicted of their murders and died in prison proclaiming her innocence. The truth of what happened in the Hoyt home between 1965 and 1971 may never be known with absolute certainty. The jury heard the evidence and made their determination. The medical community has largely accepted that these were homicides rather than natural deaths. But questions and doubts remain, particularly around the reliability of the confession that formed the basis of the conviction. What is certain is that 5 babies died, that their deaths devastated their family and community, and that the case changed how medicine and law enforcement approach unexplained infant deaths. The Hoyt case stands as a reminder that truth can be elusive, that certainty is sometimes impossible, and that the intersection of medicine, law, and human tragedy can create situations where justice is difficult to achieve and define. The Waneta Hoyt case reminds us how medical understanding evolves and how important it is to question assumptions even about cases that seem settled. If you're a medical professional encountering unusual patterns in infant deaths, trust your instincts and investigate thoroughly. The advances in SIDS research came partly from doctors who questioned accepted wisdom. If you're a new parent overwhelmed by a crying baby, remember that it's okay to put the baby down in a safe place and walk away for a few minutes. Babies can cry, but they must be kept safe. This complex case raises important questions about justice, science, and truth. If it made you think about these issues, please share your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if you appreciate the depth of research we put into these cases. And subscribe to True Crime Silent Files for more investigations that don't shy away from complexity and controversy. We're committed to presenting all sides of these tragic stories so you can understand the full picture. Case 9, Mary Beth Tinning. Date of crimes, 1972 to 1985. Court County, Schenectady County. Convicted, second-degree murder. Over the span of 14 years, Mary Beth Tinning's 9 children died one by one in Schenectady, New York. The deaths occurred in a pattern so statistically improbable that it defied reasonable explanation through natural causes. Yet for more than a decade, each death was accepted as tragedy, genetic disorders, SIDS, unfortunate medical conditions, terrible luck. Medical professionals, while sometimes puzzled, found explanations for each individual death. But behind the grief-stricken mother facade that Mary Beth presented to the world, prosecutors would later argue, was a serial killer who preyed on the most vulnerable victims imaginable, her own children. The deaths began in January 1972 when Jennifer Tinning, just 8 days old, died of what was attributed to hemorrhagic meningitis with bilateral subdural hematomas, bleeding in the brain and around it. This first death was accepted as natural, a tragic medical condition that can affect newborns. 2 weeks later, the family was struck by another devastating loss when Joseph Tinning, Mary Beth and Joseph Sr.'s 2-year-old son, died of what was called Reye's syndrome, a serious condition that can cause swelling in the liver and brain. Less than a month after Joseph's death, 4-year-old Barbara Tinning, Mary Beth's daughter from Joseph Sr.'s previous relationship, died of what was diagnosed as cardiac arrest. 3 children dead in the span of about 5 weeks. The rapid succession of deaths was devastating, truly unimaginable tragedy for any family to endure. Doctors found medical explanations for each death. Jennifer's death from meningitis, while tragic, was a recognized medical condition. Joseph's death from Reye's syndrome, though less common, was also a known pediatric emergency. Barbara's cardiac arrest, while sudden and shocking, could theoretically occur even in young children with undiagnosed heart conditions. The Tinning family appeared to be experiencing an extraordinary, horrific run of terrible luck and possibly genetic factors that made their children vulnerable to serious medical conditions. The community rallied around Mary Beth and Joseph Tinning, offering sympathy, support, and practical help to a family dealing with incomprehensible loss. Friends and neighbors could scarcely imagine the grief of losing 3 children in such a short period. The Tinnings received casseroles, sympathy cards, visits from concerned community members, and the support that communities typically provide to families experiencing tragedy. But the deaths didn't stop with those first 3 children. Over the next 13 years, 6 more of Mary Beth's children would die, each at a young age, each under circumstances that were medically puzzling but individually explainable. Timothy in December 1973 at age 4 months. Nathan in September 1975 at 5 months old. Mary Frances in February 1979 at 4 months old. Jonathan in March 1980 at 2.5 months old. Michael in March 1981 at 2.5 months old. And finally Tammy Lynn in December 1985 at 4 months old. Most of these later deaths were attributed to SIDS or similar unexplained causes of infant death. Each time, Mary Beth reported finding the baby not breathing, sometimes in a crib, sometimes in her arms. Each time, emergency responders rushed to try to save a child who was already beyond help, already dead or dying. And each time, the death was recorded as natural causes, SIDS, or undetermined, tragic but not criminal. The pattern that emerges when looking at all 9 deaths together is striking. 8 of the 9 children died between 2.5 months and 4 months of age, a remarkably consistent age range. All were found by Mary Beth when they had stopped breathing. None died in the presence of witnesses other than Mary Beth. and the statistical probability of 9 children in one family dying of natural causes during infancy was so infinitesimally small as to be essentially impossible. But individually, each death seemed explainable. SIDS, while poorly understood, was recognized as a real phenomenon that killed apparently healthy infants. The medical community in the 1970s and early 80s didn't have the sophisticated understanding of SIDS versus suffocation that would develop later. Doctors accepted that some families might have genetic predispositions that put multiple children at risk, even though 9 deaths far exceeded anything documented in medical literature as naturally occurring familial SIDS. Tammy Lynn's death in December 1985 finally triggered intensive investigation. By this time, medical understanding of SIDS had advanced. The pattern of deaths in the Tinning family had become impossible to ignore. A 4-month-old baby was the 9th child Mary Beth Tinning had lost. 9th. Even in an era when SIDS was not well understood, when genetic factors were considered possible explanations for multiple infant deaths, 9 deaths demanded scrutiny beyond sympathy. Investigators began asking hard questions that should have been asked years earlier. How could one woman lose 9 children? What were the actual medical findings in each case? Were there commonalities beyond the age range and the fact that Mary Beth was always alone when the children died? Medical experts were consulted to review the evidence from all 9 deaths with fresh eyes and modern understanding. Mary Beth Tinning was brought in for questioning by investigators from the New York State Police. The interrogation was lengthy and intense. Investigators confronted her with the statistical impossibility of 9 natural deaths, with medical evidence that suggested some of the deaths were not natural, and with their suspicion that she had killed her children. And like Waneta Hoyt before her, Mary Beth eventually confessed, at least partially. She admitted to smothering 3 of her children, Timothy, Nathan, and Tammy Lynn. In her confession, she described holding pillows or towels over their faces when they cried excessively or when she felt overwhelmed by the demands of infant care. She said she would apply pressure until they stopped breathing, then wait a period before calling for help to ensure they were truly dead. But she claimed the other 6 children had died of natural causes. According to her confession, Jennifer's meningitis, Joseph's Reye's syndrome, Barbara's cardiac arrest, and the deaths of Mary Frances, Jonathan, and Michael were all genuine medical tragedies. Only 3 of the 9 deaths were murders, according to this account. Her admission to 3 murders opened the door to suspicion about all 9 deaths, but proving murder in the other 6 cases would be extremely difficult more than a decade after they occurred. The bodies had been buried, limiting what medical re-examination could determine. The original medical investigations had been conducted with the assumption of natural death, meaning evidence of suffocation might not have been properly documented or preserved. And Mary Beth herself denied killing those 6 children. Prosecutors made the strategic decision to focus on the death of Tammy Lynn, the most recent and best documented case. This was the death for which the most physical evidence existed. The medical records were most complete, and witnesses' memories were freshest. It was also a death Mary Beth had admitted causing. The case against Mary Beth Tinning for the murder of Tammy Lynn went to trial in 1987. The prosecution presented medical evidence suggesting smothering, introduced Mary Beth's confession to killing Tammy Lynn and 2 other children, and provided context through the pattern of 9 deaths that made innocent explanations implausible. Medical experts testified about the findings in Tammy Lynn's autopsy and how they were consistent with suffocation. They explained that certain signs initially attributed to possible SIDS were actually more indicative of smothering when properly analyzed. They discussed the statistical impossibility of 9 SIDS deaths in one family, presenting calculations that showed the probability was so small as to be essentially 0. The prosecution also presented evidence about Mary Beth's psychological state and possible motivation. Experts testified about Munchausen syndrome by proxy and other disorders where caregivers harm those in their care to gain attention, sympathy, or to fulfill psychological needs. They suggested that Mary Beth had become addicted to the attention and sympathy she received as a grieving mother, that she craved the concern and support from the community that came with each death. Witnesses described how Mary Beth seemed to seek out sympathy, how she talked frequently about her dead children, how she seemed to draw a kind of satisfaction from the role of tragic mother. Some testified that there was something performative about her grief, that it seemed calculated to elicit maximum sympathy rather than genuine mourning. The defense argued that Mary Beth suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy and other mental illnesses that made her not fully responsible for her actions. They presented her as mentally ill rather than evil, someone who needed treatment, not imprisonment. They argued that mental disease or defect had impaired her capacity to understand that what she was doing was wrong. Defense experts testified about various psychiatric conditions that could explain Mary Beth's behavior. They discussed how losing the first 3 children to genuine natural causes might have triggered a psychological crisis that led her to seek the attention and sympathy associated with grief by causing subsequent deaths. They characterized her as deeply disturbed rather than criminally culpable. They also attacked the reliability of her confession, suggesting it had been coerced or that Mary Beth, who had limited intellectual capacity, had confessed to escape the pressure of interrogation. They argued that the confession should be given limited weight, particularly for the deaths she claimed were natural. But prosecutors maintained that regardless of psychological motivation, Mary Beth had deliberately killed her children, at minimum 3, and likely all 9. They argued that mental illness might explain why someone would commit such crimes, but didn't excuse them or eliminate criminal responsibility. They pointed out that Mary Beth had been functional enough to deceive medical professionals, investigators, and her community for more than a decade, suggesting she understood what she was doing and knew it was wrong. In 1987, after a trial that garnered significant media attention, Mary Beth Tinning was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Tammy Lynn. The jury rejected the insanity defense, finding that while Mary Beth might have been mentally disturbed, she was criminally responsible for her actions. She was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The conviction on one count left 8 other deaths officially unexplained. The other children, Jennifer, Joseph, Barbara, Timothy, Nathan, Mary Frances, Jonathan, and Michael, were never the subject of murder prosecutions. Their deaths remain officially attributed to various medical causes or SIDS, though most investigators and medical professionals who reviewed the cases believed at least some and possibly all were murders. The question of how many children Mary Beth actually killed may never be definitively answered. She confessed to 3. Statistical analysis and medical re-examination suggested more, possibly all 9. But without her confession or definitive medical evidence, and with the passage of so much time, proving murder in the other cases would have been extremely difficult. Mary Beth Tinning remained in prison for more than 3 decades after her conviction, becoming one of the longest-serving female inmates in New York State. She was denied parole multiple times, with parole boards citing the heinous nature of her crimes, the vulnerability of her victims, and concerns about her lack of full accountability. In each parole hearing, she maintained that she had only killed the 3 children she confessed to killing, not all 9, and she showed limited remorse or insight into her actions. In July 2018, after serving 31 years, Mary Beth Tinning was granted parole. The decision was controversial and generated significant media coverage and public outcry. Victims' advocates, child protection organizations, and community members who remembered the case protested her release. But the parole board determined that at age 77, after more than 3 decades in prison, she had served sufficient time and posed minimal risk to public safety, given her age and changed circumstances. She was released with strict parole conditions, required to report regularly to parole officers, forbidden from contact with children, and subject to monitoring for the remainder of her life. She returned to the Schenectady area to live out her remaining years in freedom, a freedom her 9 children never got to experience. The 9 children of Mary Beth Tinning ranged from 8 days old to 4 years old at the time of their deaths. They were infants and toddlers at the most vulnerable stages of life. If they had lived, the youngest would now be in their late 30s, the oldest in their 50s. They might have grown up, had careers, married, had children of their own. Instead, their lives were cut short, their potential never realized, their futures stolen. What is known is that 9 children died under Mary Beth Tinning's care between 1972 and 1985. Whether all 9 were murdered or whether some died naturally while others were killed, the outcome is the same. 9 young lives lost, 9 futures erased, 9 children who deserved to grow up but never got the chance. The Tinning case, like the Hoyt case, changed how medical professionals and investigators approach multiple infant deaths in families. It contributed to better understanding of how to distinguish SIDS from suffocation. It prompted more careful investigation when patterns of death seem improbable. And it serves as a reminder that serial infanticide, while rare, is real and can be hidden behind diagnoses of SIDS or other medical conditions. The Mary Beth Tinning case shows how important it is to recognize patterns that don't make sense, even when each individual event seems explainable. If you're a medical professional seeing multiple unexplained infant deaths in one family, push for thorough investigation. Your vigilance could save the next child's life. The improvements in how we understand and investigate SIDS came from cases like this, where doctors and investigators refuse to accept statistical impossibilities as coincidence. This case reminds us that justice can take decades, but must still be pursued. If this story made you think about how we protect vulnerable children and investigate suspicious deaths, please share this video to raise awareness. Hit that like button to support in-depth true crime journalism that doesn't sensationalize but educates. And subscribe to True Crime Silent Files for more cases that examine not just what happened, but how we can learn from tragedy to prevent future deaths. Your engagement helps us continue this important work. Case 10, Gigi Jordan. Date of crime, February 4, 2010. Court County, New York County, Manhattan. Convicted, first-degree manslaughter. In a luxury suite at the Peninsula Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, one of New York's most expensive and prestigious hotels, 8-year-old Jude Mira lay dying on the night of February 4, 2010. His mother, Gigi Jordan, a wealthy pharmaceutical executive and millionaire businesswoman, had forced a lethal cocktail of pills down his throat. When hotel staff and emergency responders finally gained entry to the barricaded room on February 5, they found Jude dead and Gigi in critical condition from her own attempted overdose. The case would become one of the most complex, controversial, and heavily publicized in New York criminal history, raising questions about mental illness, wealth and privilege, the limits of a mother's protective instincts, and how the criminal justice system handles defendants whose actions seem to result from severe mental illness rather than criminal malice. The intersection of money, mental health, autism, and matricide would create a legal saga that stretched over a decade. Gigi Jordan was not a typical criminal defendant. She was a multi-millionaire businesswoman with connections to powerful people in politics, business, and high society. She had built a successful career in the pharmaceutical industry, founding companies and making deals worth millions of dollars. She lived a life of luxury that included expensive apartments, international travel, private schools for her son, and access to the best of everything money could buy. But behind the success and wealth was a woman spiraling into paranoid delusions about threats to herself and her son. The deterioration of Gigi's mental health had been gradual but severe, eventually consuming her judgment and leading to the events of that February night in a Manhattan hotel. According to Gigi's account, contested by prosecutors, she killed Jude to protect him from worse fates. She claimed to believe, with the certainty of paranoid delusion, that her ex-husband and others were sexually abusing Jude and planning to kill both mother and son. In her disturbed mental state, she maintained that by killing Jude herself, she was sparing him torture and death at the hands of others. After killing him, she planned to take her own life so they could die together, escaping the terrible fate she believed awaited them. The prosecution told a dramatically different story. They presented evidence that Jude was autistic and required intensive care that was expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. They suggested Gigi was overwhelmed by the demands of parenting a special needs child, exhausted by the constant challenges, and frustrated by Jude's difficult behaviors. The supposed threats she feared were delusions, products of severe mental illness rather than reality. She killed Jude not to protect him from others, but because she couldn't handle the burden of his care any longer, they argued. The evidence of what happened in that hotel room was disturbing and tragic. Gigi had checked into the Peninsula Hotel, one of Manhattan's most luxurious establishments, on February 4th. She had brought Jude with her, along with a collection of medications she had accumulated. She had barricaded the door to prevent anyone from entering the room. Over the course of several hours, she force-fed Jude a combination of pills including Ambien, Xanax, hydrocodone, and other medications, a lethal cocktail designed to cause death through overdose. The process was not quick or painless. Jude, despite his autism and communication challenges, understood something terrible was happening. He resisted. He tried to push away his mother's hands. He attempted to avoid swallowing the pills. But Gigi overpowered him. She ground up pills and mixed them into food to trick him into consuming them. When that didn't work quickly enough, she physically forced pills into his mouth and held his mouth closed until he swallowed. The struggle would have been frightening for Jude, who was old enough to understand danger but not old enough or able to escape from his mother. Medical evidence presented at trial described the effects of the drug cocktail on Jude's body. The combination of sedatives, painkillers, and other medications would have caused drowsiness, confusion, difficulty breathing, and eventually unconsciousness and death. Jude would have suffered through the process of dying from the overdose, experiencing fear and physical distress before the medications finally stopped his breathing and heartbeat. After Jude died, Gigi consumed pills herself, though the amount she took was not sufficient to ensure death. Whether this was because she couldn't bring herself to take enough, because she miscalculated the lethal dose, or because some part of her wanted to survive remained unclear. Hotel staff, concerned when Gigi and Jude didn't emerge from the room and didn't respond to knocks, eventually gained entry to find the tragic scene. The hotel room had been barricaded with furniture pushed against the door. Gigi had left behind communications, emails, texts, written notes, suggesting she believed she was protecting Jude from imminent danger. These communications described her paranoid beliefs about people planning to harm them, about conspiracies involving her ex-husbands, about threats that she perceived as real and immediate, but that investigation would show had no basis in reality. The case immediately attracted intense media attention. A wealthy pharmaceutical executive kills her autistic son in a luxury Manhattan hotel. The story had every element that generates headlines: money, mental illness, a special needs child, luxury hotel, and the fundamental horror of a mother killing her child. The investigation revealed Gigi's deteriorating mental state in the months and years leading up to Jude's death. She had become increasingly paranoid, believing in complex conspiracies and threats. She had accused her ex-husband of molesting Jude, claims that investigators found no evidence to support. She had isolated herself and Jude, pulling away from friends and support systems. She had exhibited behavior that suggested severe mental illness, though she had not been receiving consistent psychiatric treatment. Jude himself was an 8-year-old boy with autism who required special care, patience, and support. Autism spectrum disorder presents differently in every individual, but Jude's autism apparently involved communication challenges, behavioral difficulties, and the need for specialized education and therapy. Caring for a child with autism can be demanding even with extensive support and resources, and despite Gigi's wealth, she appeared to have been struggling. The trial that followed was complex, lengthy, and featured competing narratives about Gigi's mental state, her motivations, and her criminal culpability. Defense attorneys portrayed Gigi as a loving mother driven to desperate acts by legitimate fear and severe mental illness. They presented evidence of her paranoid beliefs, her deteriorating mental health, and her genuine conviction that she was protecting Jude from worse harm. They argued she was not criminally responsible due to mental disease or defect, that her severe mental illness prevented her from understanding that what she was doing was wrong. Mental health experts testified for the defense about Gigi's psychiatric conditions. They described paranoid delusions, possible bipolar disorder, and other mental health issues that had impaired her judgment and grasp on reality. They argued that in Gigi's delusional state, she genuinely believed killing Jude was an act of protection and mercy, not murder. They presented evidence of the threatening communications Gigi had received or believed she had received. They showed emails and texts that fed into her paranoid worldview. They argued that from Gigi's perspective, inside her delusional mental state, her actions made sense as a desperate attempt to save her son from torture and death. Prosecutors argued that regardless of mental state, Gigi had deliberately planned and executed the murder of her son. They presented evidence of her methodical preparations for the killing. She had accumulated medications over time. She had chosen a hotel as the location rather than her home, suggesting premeditation and planning. She had barricaded the room to prevent intervention. She had researched drug overdoses and lethal doses. They argued that the brutal reality of force-feeding lethal drugs to a struggling 8-year-old child could not be excused by mental illness. They pointed out that Gigi had been functional enough to run businesses, manage her finances, and navigate complex situations, suggesting she retained substantial capacity to understand her actions. Prosecutors presented evidence challenging Gigi's claims about threats to Jude. They investigated her allegations of sexual abuse and molestation and found no evidence to support them. They interviewed people Gigi claimed were part of conspiracies against her and found no basis for her fears. They argued that the threats existed only in Gigi's delusional mind, not in reality. They also presented evidence suggesting that Gigi was overwhelmed by the challenges of parenting Jude, exhausted by his needs, and motivated by a desire to escape the burden rather than by protective instincts. They introduced testimony from caregivers and therapists who had worked with Jude about the extent of his needs and the challenges Gigi faced. The jury faced an extraordinarily difficult decision. They had to determine Gigi's mental state, assess her criminal culpability, and decide between competing narratives about why she killed her son. Was she a delusional woman driven by mental illness to an act she believed was protective? Or was she an exhausted mother who chose murder over continuing to cope with a challenging child? The jury ultimately convicted Gigi Jordan of manslaughter in the first degree, rejecting both the prosecution's murder charge and the defense's insanity argument. The manslaughter conviction represented a middle ground. The jury found that Gigi had intentionally killed Jude, but that circumstances, likely including her mental state, reduced her culpability from murder to manslaughter. In 2014, Judge Charles Solomon sentenced Gigi to 18 years in prison. The sentence was significant, but less than the maximum that could have been imposed for first-degree manslaughter. The judge's sentencing remarks reflected the complexity of the case, acknowledging Gigi's mental illness while emphasizing that Jude was an innocent victim who deserved protection. But the case didn't end with conviction and sentencing. Gigi's legal team continued fighting, filing appeals arguing that her trial had been flawed. They challenged jury instructions, evidentiary rulings, and other aspects of the trial process. The appeals process stretched on for years as Gigi remained incarcerated. In a stunning development in 2020, Gigi's conviction was vacated by an appellate court on technical grounds related to jury instructions. The court found that the trial judge had made errors in instructing the jury about extreme emotional disturbance, a factor that could reduce murder to manslaughter. Because these instructions were flawed, the conviction was overturned, and Gigi was released from prison pending a potential retrial. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office faced a decision about whether to retry the case. More than a decade had passed since Jude's death. Witnesses' memories would be less reliable. Gigi had already served years in prison. The legal and factual complexity of the case would make a retrial challenging. Prosecutors prepared to retry the case, but events intervened. In February 2021, before a retrial could proceed, Gigi Jordan died by suicide at age 62. She jumped from the balcony of a building in Brooklyn, ending her life and ending the legal saga that had consumed more than a decade. Her death meant there would be no retrial, no final legal determination of her guilt or innocence after the vacated conviction. Gigi's suicide prompted varied reactions. Some saw it as a final act of a troubled woman who couldn't live with what she had done to her son. Others viewed it as evidence of ongoing severe mental illness. Still others interpreted it as Gigi choosing to escape accountability for Jude's death rather than face another trial. 8-year-old Jude Mira was a child with autism who required special care and patience. Despite his challenges, he had a personality, preferences, and a life worth living. Those who worked with him described him as having moments of joy, as responding to music and certain activities, as being a child who deserved support and love rather than death. His mother made the decision that his life should end, not because Jude wanted to die or because his quality of life was unbearable, but because she believed, wrongly, that death was preferable to the threats she imagined. Or, as prosecutors argued, because she found the demands of his care too overwhelming to continue. Whether Gigi Jordan was a delusional woman driven by mental illness to an act she believed was protective, or a murderer who escaped full justice through legal technicalities and ultimately through suicide, remains debated. Her mental illness was real. That much seems certain from the evidence. Whether that mental illness excused her killing of Jude or merely explained it is a question that may never be definitively answered after the conviction was vacated and she died before retrial. What is indisputable is that Jude Mira deserved a chance to grow up. He deserved to continue receiving the therapies and support that might have helped him develop his capabilities. He deserved to experience adolescence and adulthood, to discover what he might achieve and who he might become. His mother took that chance away, ending his life in a Manhattan hotel room when he was just 8 years old. The case raised important questions about mental illness and criminal justice. How should the system handle defendants whose actions appear to result from severe mental illness? What level of mental dysfunction excuses criminal behavior? How do we balance compassion for mental illness with accountability for crimes and protection of victims? These questions remain relevant and unresolved. It also highlighted challenges facing parents of children with special needs. Raising a child with autism or other developmental disabilities can be demanding, expensive, and emotionally exhausting. Parents need support, resources, respite care, and understanding. While Gigi Jordan had financial resources most families can't imagine, money alone doesn't solve all challenges, particularly when mental illness prevents someone from using resources effectively. The Gigi Jordan case reminds us that mental illness is real, serious, and can have deadly consequences when left untreated. If you're a parent of a special needs child feeling overwhelmed to the point of crisis, please reach out for help before tragedy occurs. And if you know someone with severe mental illness, encourage them to get treatment. Early intervention can prevent tragedy. This case shows how complex the intersection of mental illness, parenting challenges, and criminal justice can be. If it made you think about these important issues, please share this video to promote understanding. Hit that like button to support thoughtful true crime content that examines not just what happened, but why and how we might prevent similar tragedies. And subscribe to True Crime Silent Files for more in-depth investigations that treat these cases with the seriousness and complexity they deserve. These cases are not just stories from New York. They are real events involving real children. 10 cases, 10 mothers, 29 dead children. We have journeyed through more than 5 decades of crimes that challenge our fundamental understanding of motherhood, family, and human nature. From Waneta Hoyt in the 1960s to Karla Espinal in 2020, from small towns in upstate New York to the heart of Manhattan, these cases span geography, time, socioeconomic status, and circumstance. Yet they share a common thread: children betrayed and killed by the women who should have protected them most fiercely. These are not distant historical events or unverified stories. These crimes occurred in New York, from the boroughs of New York City to small towns of upstate, and were investigated by law enforcement, adjudicated through the criminal justice system, and documented in court records that stand as permanent testament to what happened. Some of these women are currently serving life sentences in New York State prisons. Lacey Spears will not be eligible for parole until 2035. Geraldine Perkins was sentenced to 15 years to life. Nixzaliz Santiago received 43 years to life and remains incarcerated. Awilda Lopez served 15 years and has been released. Stephanie Castillo, Gloria Asamoah, and Karla Espinal's cases proceeded through the legal system with varying outcomes. Mary Beth Tinning served 31 years before being granted parole in 2018. Released at age 77 to live out her remaining years in freedom her 9 children never experienced. Waneta Hoyt died in prison in 1998, still maintaining her innocence. And Gigi Jordan's case ended with her suicide in 2021 before a retrial could determine her guilt or innocence after her initial conviction was vacated. The children they killed were infants and toddlers, kindergartners, and elementary school students. They were vulnerable human beings ranging from newborns to 8 years old who trusted their mothers completely. That trust, the most fundamental bond in human experience, was repaid with violence, neglect, torture, poisoning, smothering, drowning, and ultimately death. Let us remember their names once more. Garnett Paul Spears, 5 years old, poisoned by his mother who suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy and craved the attention that came from having a sick child. Perkins, 6 years old, beaten and tortured to death while Child Protective Services failed to intervene despite multiple reports from concerned neighbors and teachers. Nixzmary Brown, 7 years old, starved and beaten to death in Brooklyn while the system meant to protect her moved too slowly to save her life. Elisa Izquierdo, 6 years old, systematically tortured and beaten to death in Greenwich Village, her pleas for help going unheeded until it was too late. The unnamed twin boys of Stephanie Castillo, newborns who lived only hours before being drowned in a bathtub by a mother who had options under safe haven laws but chose death instead. The unnamed twin children of Gloria Asamoah, infants under 1 year old, smothered by a mother struggling with mental health challenges and the overwhelming demands of caring for twins. Elisa Espinal, 6 years old, drowned in a bathtub in Brooklyn during the COVID-19 pandemic when systems to protect children were disrupted and families faced unprecedented stress. Eric, Julie, James, Molly, and Noah Hoyt, 5 babies who died over 6 years in what was accepted as SIDS until a confession decades later suggested they were smothered by their mother. Jennifer, Joseph, Barbara, Timothy, Nathan, Mary Frances, Jonathan, Michael, and Tammy Lynn Tinning. 9 children who died over 14 years, with Mary Beth Tinning confessing to killing 3 and suspected in the deaths of the others. And Jude Mira, 8 years old, an autistic child killed by his wealthy mother who claimed to be protecting him from imagined threats, but may have been overwhelmed by the demands of his care. 29 children, 29 futures stolen, 29 lives that mattered, that had value, that deserved protection and love, but received betrayal and death instead. As we examine these 10 cases, patterns emerge that help us understand not just what happened but why, and perhaps most importantly, how such tragedies might be prevented in the future. This has been a true crime Silent Files documentary on the most evil mothers in New York. These stories are difficult to hear, painful to contemplate, and disturbing in their implications about human nature. But they're important to tell because the only way we prevent future tragedies is by learning from past ones, by understanding what went wrong, and by committing to do better. If this documentary has opened your eyes to the realities of child abuse, if it has made you think about the children in your community who might be suffering in silence, if it has inspired you to be more vigilant and more willing to act when you suspect a child is at risk, then please share it. Knowledge is power, and awareness is the first step toward protection. Hit that like button if you appreciate the depth of research, the respectful treatment of sensitive subject matter, and the commitment to not just sensationalizing tragedy, but learning from it. Your likes tell the algorithm to show this content to more people, expanding awareness and potentially saving lives. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. How can we better protect vulnerable children? What resources exist in your community for families in crisis? Have you ever reported suspected child abuse, and what was your experience? What reforms do you think are needed in Child Protective Services? Your comments create community dialogue around these crucial issues. And subscribe to True Crime Silent Files for more in-depth investigations into cases that shocked our nation. We're committed to presenting these stories with the seriousness, complexity, and respect they deserve. We don't just recount what happened. We examine why it happened, what went wrong, and how we can prevent similar tragedies in the future. Turn on notifications so you never miss our documentaries. Each investigation represents hours of research, careful attention to verified facts, and thoughtful analysis of how tragedies occur and how they might be prevented. Most importantly, take action in your own life and community. Be vigilant. Report concerns. Support struggling parents. Advocate for better funded, better trained child protective services. And never forget that protecting children is everyone's responsibility. Thank you for watching this difficult but important documentary. Remember these children: Garnett, Zymir, Nixzmary, Elisa, Julissa, Jude, and all the others. Remember them not just as victims, but as individual human beings whose lives had value, whose potential was stolen, and whose deaths demand that we do better. Please, protect the vulnerable among us. Every child deserves safety, love, and the chance to grow up. Be the person who helps make that possible.